The sound of a gavel echoed through the courtroom, signaling the start of another day in the drab and dreary courthouse. The air was thick with tension, each person present, from the judge to the spectators, on edge. The courtroom was bustling with activity as cases piled up, yet all eyes seemed to focus on one person. Noah Johnson, a 17-year-old high school senior with a future that hung in the balance. He stood alone at the defense table, his hands nervously gripping the edge of the wood as he waited for the trial to proceed. Noah was a quiet kid, the kind who preferred to stay under the radar, focusing on schoolwork and trying to stay out of trouble. But that was before the accusation, before the lies. Now, here he was in a courtroom, fighting for his future, with everything on the line. It was a story he never imagined himself in, accused of a crime he didn't commit, facing a system stacked against him. The judge, a gruff man in his 50s with a permanent scowl etched across his face, glanced over at Noah from his perch on the high bench. He cleared his throat, his voice booming through the silence of the courtroom. "Mr. Johnson," the judge began, his tone dismissive, "do you even understand what's going on here? Do you even care?" Noah's heart raced as he stood there, trembling, trying to hold it together. He'd been through this moment in his head 1,000 times, where everything would fall apart, where he'd say the right words and somehow, miraculously, convince everyone of his innocence. But here he was, standing in front of a judge who already seemed to have made up his mind. Noah didn't have the words. His lawyer, Carl, was far from reassuring. The public defender, an overworked man with an almost constant 5 o'clock shadow, sat at the table beside him, barely looking up from his stack of paperwork. He shuffled through the documents as if his mind was 1,000 miles away, occasionally muttering to himself. The whole situation felt like a nightmare Noah couldn't wake up from. "Are you just going to stand there? Or do you have something to say?" The judge's voice cut through Noah's thoughts, sharp and impatient. The words wouldn't come. Noah wanted to scream that he didn't belong here, that he hadn't done what they accused him of, but all that came out was a dry, panicked cough. Carl glanced up for a moment, offering a weak, apologetic smile. Your Honor, my client, he's a good kid, just caught in a bad situation," Carl stammered, his voice weak, offering no real defense. The judge's eyes narrowed. A bad situation? A bad situation is something you get yourself into by being careless, by being foolish, not something that suddenly lands you in court for a serious charge. "What exactly did you think this was going to be, kid?" The judge's voice dripped with disdain. Noah felt the weight of the judge's gaze like 1,000 tons pressing down on him. He didn't even know where to begin. The whole situation felt surreal, like a bad dream he couldn't escape from. Everything was against him, and the last thing he wanted to do was make it worse by speaking out of turn. Suddenly, the courtroom doors swung open with a loud creak, and everyone turned in surprise. The figure that entered wasn't the type of person you'd expect to see in a place like this. His presence was commanding, almost cinematic in its aura of authority. The man was dressed impeccably in a sharp, dark suit, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed back, and his demeanor so calm that it immediately shifted the energy in the room. Noah's head snapped up as he stared at the new arrival, his eyes widening in confusion. The man had a certain air about him, an undeniable gravitas, but it wasn't just the suit or the calmness in his stride that caught Noah's attention. There was something oddly familiar about him, though Noah couldn't place it. The man paused at the front of the room and turned to face the judge, who was now staring at him in obvious surprise. The room had gone silent, every person now drawn into the stranger's sudden appearance. The judge blinked a few times before clearing his throat, visibly thrown off by the interruption. "Can I help you, sir?" the judge asked, his tone still rough but clearly trying to regain control of the situation. The man smiled politely. "Yes, actually, I'm Clint Eastwood," he said, his voice smooth and self-assured, sending ripples of shock through the courtroom. Clint Eastwood? The Clint Eastwood? The famous actor known for his legendary roles in movies like Dirty Harry and The Good, The Bad, and The Ugly? Noah's mind raced, his confusion deepening. Was this a joke? Was this some kind of publicity stunt? He couldn't wrap his head around what was happening. The judge blinked again, now clearly taken aback. "Excuse me," he muttered, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Clint smiled again, unfazed by the judge's bewilderment. "I'm Clint Eastwood, and I'm here to represent the kid." There was a collective gasp in the room. A few of the onlookers exchanged confused glances, while others sat in stunned silence. The judge's expression flickered between disbelief and frustration. "You're Clint Eastwood, the actor, and you're here to represent him?" The judge gestured at Noah, his voice dripping with skepticism. "What's this? Some kind of joke?" Clint, ever calm, nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. The actor, the director, the producer, and as it turns out, also a lawyer. In fact, I've been practicing law for quite a few years now. I'm just, shall we say, a little more low-key about it." Noah's heart skipped a beat. A lawyer? Clint Eastwood, a lawyer? How was that possible? He couldn't understand what was happening, but at the same time, a strange sense of hope sparked inside him. This wasn't just some random celebrity. This was Clint Eastwood, the man who had commanded the screen in so many iconic roles, now standing before a judge, about to do something that could change everything for Noah. The judge looked between Clint and Noah, clearly unsure how to proceed. "This is absurd," the judge muttered under his breath, but Clint's presence was undeniable. Clint remained composed, never breaking his calm. "I'm here for one reason and one reason only," he said, looking directly at the judge. "To make sure this young man gets a fair trial. And if that means shaking things up a bit, then so be it." The entire courtroom held its breath, the tension palpable. For the first time, Noah felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Noah Johnson had always been the quiet type. Growing up in a small town, he preferred books to parties, the safety of his own room to the chaos of high school drama. His life was supposed to be simple: graduate high school, get into college, make something of himself. But, as things often go, life had other plans. His father, Daniel Johnson, had walked out when Noah was just 5. It wasn't a dramatic exit, no shouting, no broken glass. Just an empty house and a phone call that Noah would never forget. "I can't do this," his father had said before disappearing, leaving behind nothing but a trail of unanswered questions. His mother, Jennifer Johnson, had done the best she could. She worked 2 jobs, as a waitress and a night shift cashier, to put food on the table. She loved him. Noah knew that much. But it never felt like enough. She was always tired, always stressed. There were nights when Noah would lie awake in his room, listening to the quiet hum of their apartment, wishing he could somehow take the burden off her shoulders. But there was nothing he could do. Noah had learned to keep to himself, to avoid getting in trouble. He kept his head down, made decent grades, and stayed out of the way. He was the kind of kid who'd never gotten in a fight, never been called to the principal's office, and definitely never landed in a courtroom. Until now. It all started with a misunderstanding. Or, more accurately, a series of missteps that snowballed into something far worse than anyone could have anticipated. It began a few months ago when Noah had found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. He'd been walking home from his part-time job one evening when he saw 2 older boys, Jake and Ryan, fighting outside a convenience store. Noah, ever the observer, had tried to keep his distance. He wasn't interested in getting involved. But Jake, one of the boys, had noticed him standing there. "Hey, look at the quiet kid," Jake had taunted. "What's he doing here, huh? You think you're too good for this?" Noah hadn't said a word. He just wanted to get home. But that hadn't been enough to stop Jake, who, feeling emboldened, shoved him toward the others. Ryan, who had been egging Jake on, grabbed Noah by the arm. In the chaos of the moment, punches were thrown, voices raised, and before he knew it, Noah had found himself on the ground, pinned down by Ryan's weight. The police had arrived moments later. Apparently, someone had called 911 when the altercation turned violent, and Noah, who hadn't thrown a single punch, was the one who ended up in handcuffs. The charges? Assault. They had charged him with assault. He tried to explain himself, tried to tell the officers he had just been a bystander, but it didn't matter. The police report was written. The witnesses had given their statements, and no one seemed to care about his side of the story. The other boys had their families, their stories, families that could afford high-priced lawyers, families that had influence in the small town they lived in. Noah had none of that. His mother had done her best to help, but between work and taking care of everything else, she didn't know where to turn. Their savings were barely enough to keep the lights on, let alone afford a lawyer. So, Noah had ended up with Carl, a public defender who was more interested in his next case than this one. And now, here he was. In court, the teenager in the wrong place at the wrong time, trying to prove his innocence in a world that seemed to have already decided his fate. As he sat there, staring at his hands in his lap, Noah couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. He had never imagined this. Never imagined that his life could be so easily upended by something so out of his control. He glanced over at Carl, who was once again absorbed in his paperwork. It was almost as if Carl had already written Noah off. The man was doing his best to look professional, but Noah could see it in his eyes, the exhaustion, the indifference. It wasn't the look of someone fighting for justice. It was the look of someone just trying to get through the day. Noah sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. He didn't know what to do anymore. He had always believed that if he just kept his head down, if he did what was expected of him, life would somehow work out. But that wasn't the case. And now, here he was, on trial for something he hadn't done, his future hanging in the balance. It was in that moment of hopelessness that the door had opened, and everything changed. Clint Eastwood, the man, the legend, standing in front of a judge in a courtroom, introducing himself not as an actor, but as a lawyer. The surprise of it all was enough to make Noah's heart race, though this time, it wasn't with fear. It was with a strange sense of hope. As Clint spoke, Noah could hardly believe what he was hearing. Was this really happening? Was Clint Eastwood about to save him? He looked up at Clint, who stood tall, exuding an air of confidence that Noah had never seen before in anyone. Clint wasn't just an actor. He was a man who had lived through everything, a man who knew the law inside and out, and now, he was here for Noah. As Clint confidently addressed the judge, Noah felt a stirring deep within him. He wasn't alone anymore. This wasn't just about getting through the day. This was about something more. It was about fighting for the truth. Clint wasn't just a random celebrity in the courtroom. He was a hero, a real hero, and as Noah looked at him, something inside him clicked. Maybe, just maybe, he could win this. The gavel hit the desk, and the courtroom went silent as Judge McAllister's cold, scrutinizing gaze settled on Clint Eastwood. The judge's brows furrowed, as if still struggling to process the strange turn of events that had just unfolded. The weight of Clint's sudden appearance in the courtroom hung in the air like an uncomfortable fog. Clint didn't flinch. His presence was magnetic, even intimidating, but it wasn't a show. There was an underlying seriousness in his eyes, a determination that made it clear he wasn't here for anything less than justice. The world knew Clint as an actor, a director, and a producer, but standing before the judge, he was something else entirely. A lawyer. Judge McAllister adjusted his glasses, then leaned forward, clearly trying to regain control. Mr. Eastwood, I'm not sure what kind of game you think you're playing here, but this is a courtroom, not some movie set, he snapped. If you're here to represent this boy, he pointed at Noah, who still couldn't believe what was happening, then I'm going to need some credentials. You can't just waltz in here and expect to pull strings with a smile. Clint smiled back, unfazed. You'd be surprised what a little experience and a good understanding of the law can do, Your Honor, he said, his voice calm but filled with an unshakable confidence. I've spent years training and learning under some of the best. I'm not here for games. The judge was quiet for a long moment, his eyes narrowing at Clint, before he finally spoke again. Fine, he muttered. But if you're serious about representing this kid, I expect you to prove it. This isn't a charity case. Clint nodded respectfully, but with the sort of quiet intensity that seemed to give the judge pause. I'm not here for charity, Your Honor. I'm here because Noah deserves a fair shot. We all do. The tension in the room was palpable. It was as if the whole courthouse was holding its breath. No one, including Noah, had expected this. For all he knew, this might be a fleeting moment, a brief flash of hope that would dissipate just as quickly. But Clint's presence was undeniable. It was as though the walls of the courtroom had suddenly grown taller and the air heavier. As the actor-turned-lawyer locked eyes with the judge, Noah could barely believe it. He had been completely thrown off track by Clint's entrance, but something about Clint's calm demeanor made him feel like everything might actually be okay. It was a strange feeling, one he hadn't had in weeks, hope. But the overwhelming doubts were still there. Could Clint really help him? What did this mean for the trial? The sound of a cough from the defense table snapped him out of his reverie. Carl, his public defender, was finally looking up from his paperwork. He cleared his throat and raised a hand. Your Honor, I'm Carl Wells, the public defender here. While I don't wish to undermine Mr. Eastwood's extraordinary credentials, he glanced at Clint skeptically, I'd like to remind the court that Mr. Johnson's case is one that requires a lot of careful attention and detail, not just a star-studded entrance. Noah winced at Carl's lack of enthusiasm. It was clear to him that Carl didn't see Clint as a savior. He was just another obstacle, an unwelcome distraction. Noah had never been thrilled with Carl's lack of energy in his case, but now, standing here in the courtroom with Clint Eastwood by his side, Carl's skepticism stung even more. Clint turned to Carl, not missing a beat. You're right, Mr. Wells, he said smoothly, his voice like velvet. This case does require careful attention, but I'm confident that the attention we're about to give it will be enough to ensure justice is served. Carl scoffed under his breath, but Clint ignored him, focusing instead on the judge. Your Honor, I propose that we continue with the trial. I'll represent Noah moving forward, and if the court believes my credentials are in question, we can address that after. The judge, still skeptical, leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple as he considered Clint's words. Finally, after a long, drawn-out pause, he sighed. Very well, but I expect no nonsense. If you're going to represent this boy, you better be prepared to back up your claims in front of this court. Clint's smile was calm, controlled. I wouldn't have it any other way. Noah watched, wide-eyed, as Clint turned toward him. For the first time since the trial began, Noah felt a flicker of hope. It was a feeling he had almost forgotten existed, buried beneath the weight of his fear and confusion. Clint gave him a reassuring nod. Don't worry, Noah. We're going to get through this. Just keep calm and let me handle the rest. Noah nodded weakly, still uncertain of how this would unfold. But somehow, Clint's presence in the room had made all the difference. The once intimidating and cold courtroom now felt different, less like a place where justice was skewed, and more like a place where a chance at fairness could be realized. But even as Clint prepared to speak on Noah's behalf, the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The prosecutors would be relentless. The system had already made its judgments, and though Clint Eastwood might have the power to turn the tide, the battle would still be fierce. As Clint stepped forward to present his first arguments, Noah braced himself for what was to come. He could already feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him again, but there was something else now, a strange and quiet strength deep inside that had been reignited. It wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about something bigger. It was about justice, and no matter how much the odds were stacked against him, Noah wasn't going to let go of that hope. Not now. The courtroom settled into a tense silence as Clint Eastwood made his way toward the front, positioning himself next to Noah. The once familiar sense of dread Noah had felt in the beginning of the trial had now been replaced with a flicker of determination. But that hope came with a stark realization. This was just the beginning. The battle had only begun, and the storm on the horizon was far from over. Clint turned to face Noah. This won't be easy, he said softly, his voice full of authority yet strangely comforting. But I've seen people like you, people who were counted out, people who had the world against them, and I've seen them come through. You just need to trust in the process and in me. Noah nodded, the weight of Clint's words sinking in. He had no idea how Clint had managed to get here or why he chose to intervene in his case, but he could feel the conviction behind the man's every word. For the first time in a long time, Noah felt like he wasn't alone. Clint's steely eyes moved across the courtroom as he began speaking, his deep voice carrying an almost magnetic quality. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Today we find ourselves in a situation that should never have happened, Clint began, his words deliberate and precise. A young man, a teenager, is facing charges for an incident he had no part in. My client, Noah Johnson, was merely in the wrong place at the wrong time. The jury shifted in their seats, glancing at each other. Some looked skeptical, while others were more engaged. Noah couldn't help but notice how Clint's presence seemed to dominate the room. This wasn't just a courtroom. It was a stage, and Clint had mastered it. His every move was measured, his every word calculated. Now, I understand that emotions run high in situations like this, Clint continued, glancing over at the opposing counsel, a young, eager prosecutor named Daniel Foster. But emotions alone don't justify charging an innocent young man. Noah was the victim here, victim of circumstances beyond his control. Noah's heart pounded. He wasn't used to hearing someone speak about him like that. Victim. He never thought of himself as a victim. But Clint's words, clear, direct, made him realize that maybe he deserved to be seen for more than just the person who had been caught in the chaos of that night. Clint paused for a moment, allowing his words to hang in the air. He then turned his attention toward the jury, his gaze intense and unwavering. I've been a part of many cases in my life, but this one is different. It's personal, Clint added, the hint of a challenge in his voice. This trial is about more than just defending one individual. It's about sending a message to this community, about standing up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. The jury seemed to respond, some nodding, others leaning forward, more interested than before. Noah felt his pulse quicken. Clint wasn't just defending him. He was making a statement, taking a stand for something bigger. The realization hit Noah like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about clearing his name. This was a fight for fairness, a fight for justice in a system that had often failed people like him. Daniel Foster, the prosecutor, stood up, his youthful face flushed with a mix of arrogance and anger. He straightened his tie and spoke, his voice cutting through the room. Your Honor, while I respect the theatrics of Mr. Eastwood's grand entrance, the facts remain unchanged. Noah Johnson was involved in a physical altercation. He was seen fighting, causing harm, and disturbing the peace. Clint didn't flinch. He calmly addressed the accusation. Mr. Foster, with all due respect, the facts in this case are not as clear-cut as you would have the jury believe. We know that there are discrepancies in the witness statements, that there are holes in the narrative you've presented, and we have the evidence to prove it. The tension between the two lawyers was palpable, like two warriors facing off on a battlefield. The jury exchanged uneasy glances as they took in the contrast between Clint's calm, composed demeanor and Daniel's more aggressive, almost desperate energy. Noah's mind raced. Could Clint really pull this off? Could he really prove his innocence? As the day wore on, Clint and Daniel exchanged words, but Clint kept his cool. It was as if he had done this 1,000 times before. He used every opportunity to chip away at the prosecutor's case, pointing out inconsistencies in the testimonies and revealing gaps in the evidence. The more Clint spoke, the more Noah felt his confidence grow. This was no longer about hope. It was about conviction, the belief that something could actually change, that truth could rise to the surface. But even with Clint's powerful arguments, Noah knew this wasn't going to be a quick win. Daniel Foster was relentless, and the odds were still stacked against them. There was still a long road ahead. And even with Clint Eastwood in his corner, Noah couldn't shake the feeling that the system was designed to favor those with money, influence, and power. For the first time, Noah allowed himself to feel the weight of the case, the importance of what was happening. It wasn't just his future on the line. It was a fight for the very idea of fairness. The day dragged on as both sides presented their evidence. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder with each passing minute. Noah could feel the exhaustion in his bones, but he refused to let it break his focus. Clint was still in control, still fighting with the precision of a seasoned lawyer. But there was something more. He was fighting not just for Noah, but for the very principle of justice. As the court session came to a close, Clint turned to Noah and gave him a reassuring nod. This isn't over, but we've made a good start. Now, we wait. But remember, Noah, in this fight, we're not alone. You've got people who believe in you. You've got me. For the first time since this nightmare began, Noah smiled. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Clint Eastwood, a legend in his own right, had given him something he never thought he'd have again, a fighting chance. The courtroom was emptying out for the day, the echoes of conversations blending with the rustling of papers and the shuffle of footsteps. Noah sat quietly at the defense table, his mind replaying everything Clint Eastwood had said, every word of defense and every piercing rebuttal to the prosecution's case. His heart raced, still in disbelief that Clint was really here, fighting for him. An ordinary teenager caught in a situation far beyond his control. Clint had stayed calm the entire time, never faltering, always calculating. Noah couldn't understand how Clint managed to make the complexities of law seem so simple, how he navigated the trial like a seasoned pro despite the overwhelming odds. But one thing was clear, Clint was a force. And it wasn't just his fame that made him a presence in the courtroom. It was his experience, his unwavering belief in justice, that had Noah believing for the first time in what felt like forever. "Hey," Clint's voice broke through Noah's thoughts as he sat down next to him. "How are you holding up?" Noah nodded, looking up at Clint. The words were stuck in his throat for a moment, but he managed to say, I think I'm doing better. You've got this under control, don't you?" Clint chuckled softly, his voice warm but steady. "I wouldn't say under control. This is a fight, and we're just getting started. But we've got the right pieces in place, and we're going to put together the best case we can." Noah gave a nervous smile. He wanted to believe Clint, truly he did, but doubts still lingered. He knew that the evidence wasn't on his side. He had been at the scene, caught up in the chaos. How could they prove his innocence? It all seemed like a long shot. Clint, sensing the unease, turned to face him, his eyes sharp. "You need to trust the process, Noah. And trust me, I've been through battles like this before, and they don't always go the way people expect. But you're not in this alone anymore." Noah swallowed hard. "I don't know if I can do this. The pressure it's so much. What if it's all for nothing?" Clint placed a hand on his shoulder, a reassuring gesture. "It's not for nothing. Every step you take, every piece of this puzzle we put together, it's all part of a bigger plan. You just have to keep your head in the game. We can't control what the jury will do, but we can make sure the truth is heard." Noah closed his eyes for a moment, taking in Clint's words. The courtroom might have felt like a battlefield, but Clint made it seem like they had a chance. A real one. "Okay," Noah said, his voice stronger now. "Let's do it." The next few days were a blur. Clint worked tirelessly, going over every detail of the case, interviewing witnesses, and preparing arguments with a precision that left Noah in awe. They spent hours in the courthouse, with Clint teaching Noah how to remain composed under pressure, how to answer questions with clarity, and most importantly, how to believe in his own story. Noah was starting to see things differently. Instead of feeling trapped by the overwhelming odds, he began to feel empowered by the support around him. He wasn't fighting alone. Clint, despite his fame and achievements, had never treated him like a charity case. He had treated him like a person who deserved a fair shot. One afternoon, as they reviewed witness testimonies, Clint suddenly stopped and turned toward Noah. "I want to ask you something," he said, his tone serious. "What made you go to the scene that night? You've been through a lot, I know, but I need to understand why you were there. Was there something you were trying to do?" Noah hesitated, the memory of that night flooding back, his heart racing, the sound of raised voices, the chaos that had unfolded. "I was just trying to help," he said, his voice shaky. "I saw someone I knew, and I didn't want them to get hurt, but I ended up getting caught in the middle of it all." Clint nodded thoughtfully, his eyes narrowing as he processed the information. "That's important, Noah. You're not some troublemaker looking for a fight. You were trying to do the right thing. And that's the story we're going to tell." Noah felt a spark of hope. It was a small flicker, but it was real. Clint wasn't just fighting for him. He was fighting for the truth, no matter how messy or complicated it was. Days passed, and as the trial approached its climax, tensions ran high. Each day, Noah felt the weight of the court's judgment pressing down on him, but Clint's steady presence was a constant anchor. In every moment of uncertainty, Clint was there, guiding him with calm precision. And then, The day of the closing arguments arrived. Clint stood at the front of the courtroom once more, this time without the calm reassurance that had marked the beginning of the trial. There was a fire in his eyes now, a resolve that was impossible to ignore. He turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clint began, his voice strong, commanding attention. "We've heard a lot of facts, a lot of accusations, and a lot of assumptions in this trial. But the one thing we haven't heard is the truth." He paused for a moment, letting the words settle in. Noah Johnson didn't ask for this. He didn't go looking for trouble. He was simply a young man in the wrong place at the wrong time, trying to do what was right. And yet, because of that, he stands accused of a crime he didn't commit. Clint's voice grew more impassioned. "I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here to ask you to look at the facts. Facts that the prosecution has conveniently ignored. Facts that show Noah's innocence. Facts that show that he was the one trying to help, trying to stop the situation from getting worse." He turned to Noah, who was sitting at the defense table, his nerves building once again. But this time, instead of fear, Noah felt something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. Clint was speaking up for him in a way no one else ever had. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Clint continued, "I'm not asking for a favor. I'm asking for justice, a fair trial, based on the truth, not on assumptions or prejudices. This young man deserves a future, a chance at life, and it's up to you to decide whether he gets that chance." The room was deathly quiet as Clint finished his statement, his gaze steady, his presence impossible to ignore. Noah was left with only one thought: this is it. This is our chance. The days following Clint's powerful closing arguments were an agonizing blur for Noah. He had felt the intense weight of the trial lifting as Clint had spoken with such unwavering passion, but that was only the beginning. Now, it was time for the jury to deliberate, and the tension was nearly unbearable. Noah could barely keep still in the small, dimly lit room they had retreated to. Clint had told him to stay focused, that the outcome was out of their hands now, but how could he? His mind spun with endless possibilities. What if the jury didn't believe Clint's arguments? What if they still saw him as guilty? What if this was the end of everything? Clint, however, seemed oddly calm. His posture was relaxed, his gaze steady, as he flipped through a few legal documents, seemingly unaffected by the immense tension hanging in the air. Every now and then, he'd glance over at Noah, his eyes filled with quiet assurance. "It's going to be all right," Clint had said earlier that morning. But Noah wasn't so sure. How could he be? The hours dragged on. Each minute felt like an eternity, and with every passing second, Noah's anxiety grew. He tried to breathe deeply, but the tight knot in his chest wouldn't loosen. The moment seemed to stretch into infinity, leaving him feeling more and more trapped in his own mind. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, the door to the room opened. A clerk stepped inside, and all eyes immediately turned toward him. "Jury has reached a verdict," the clerk announced, his voice steady but formal. The words sent a chill down Noah's spine. The verdict, his future, all of it rested in the hands of 12 strangers who had listened to the testimony, seen the evidence, and now had to decide if Noah was guilty or innocent. Noah's heart pounded in his chest as he followed Clint's lead and stood up. Clint gave him a subtle nod, as if to remind him to stay calm. Noah wasn't sure how he was supposed to keep it together, but he nodded back, taking a deep breath. They made their way to the courtroom. The air inside felt thick, the tension palpable. The judge, an older man with a sharp gaze, sat at the bench, waiting. The jury, seated in their designated box, looked back at Noah and Clint with unreadable expressions. Everything about the moment was surreal, almost as if Noah were watching himself from the outside. The judge cleared his throat. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a woman in her 40s with glasses perched at the edge of her nose, stood up. The room held its breath. "We have, Your Honor," she said. The words seemed to hang in the air, each syllable hanging on the precipice of what would come next. The clerk took the verdict slip from her, unfolded it, and read aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Noah Johnson, not guilty of all charges." The room fell into complete silence. Noah felt as though the ground beneath him had disappeared. His mind couldn't process the words. Not guilty. It wasn't possible. Not after everything. The fights, the lies, the accusations. He'd been expecting the worst. But this was something else entirely. Then, a wave of relief washed over him. It wasn't instant. It took a moment for the weight of the words to sink in. But once they did, it felt as though every ounce of fear and anxiety he'd been carrying for so long had been lifted. The jury began to rise, and Clint was at Noah's side in an instant, his hand gently resting on Noah's shoulder. The sense of camaraderie between them was evident, as if Clint had taken every step with him, through every moment of doubt and fear. Right up until this moment, the judge nodded solemnly. The defendant is free to go. Court is adjourned. Noah stood there for a moment, his knees weak, his chest heaving as he took in the gravity of the situation. He had been acquitted. The case that had consumed his life for so long was over. And it wasn't just the case. It was the possibility of a future, the chance at redemption, the chance to rebuild the life that had felt broken just weeks ago. Clint gave him a small smile, his weathered face softening for the first time since Noah had met him. "You did it, kid," he said simply. "You held on." Noah could hardly believe it. "I don't know what to say. Thank you for everything." Clint shook his head, his smile fading into a look of quiet respect. "You don't have to say anything. You fought for yourself. I just showed you how." The reality of the moment hit Noah all at once. He was free. The weight of the court case had been lifted, but there was so much more that needed to be done. He couldn't forget the journey he'd been on, how far he'd come. There were still pieces to put together in his life, but this was a new beginning. As they left the courthouse, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the street. It was almost as if the world itself was offering Noah a fresh start. Clint walked beside him, his steps measured, but there was a subtle spring in his stride now, as if the victory had energized him too. Noah's mind raced with the possibilities ahead. There was still a long road to walk, but now, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe again. "Where do we go from here?" Noah asked as they stepped outside into the fresh air. Clint glanced over at him, a grin tugging at the corner of his lips. "We keep moving forward. You're free now, Noah. You've earned that right. Whatever happens next is up to you." Noah nodded, his chest swelling with a sense of gratitude. "I won't waste this chance. I won't forget what you've done for me." Clint stopped walking for a moment, turning to face him. "I hope not, Noah. I hope not." As they walked on together, Noah knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning. The following weeks after the trial felt like a whirlwind. Noah, now free, was living in a world that no longer seemed quite as uncertain as it had been just a few months ago. His life had taken an unexpected turn, one that was more thrilling and terrifying than he had ever imagined. As the court's final ruling echoed in his mind, he knew one thing for sure. His old life, the one filled with fear, doubt, and uncertainty, was behind him. But despite the newfound sense of freedom, a part of him still felt lost. For all the triumph, Noah found himself standing on the precipice of something new without any clear idea of what his next steps should be. He'd spent so much time worrying about the trial and surviving the chaos that he hadn't allowed himself the luxury of thinking beyond that. Clint, ever the guiding figure, seemed to sense his hesitation. They'd stayed in touch since the trial, meeting for coffee, talking about life, and, in some cases, Clint offering words of wisdom about moving forward. There was an ease between them now, a connection that hadn't been there before. On a bright morning, Clint invited Noah out for a long drive, a chance for them to talk, really talk, about what was next for Noah. Clint had been there for the worst of times, but Noah realized he hadn't taken the opportunity to ask Clint about his own life. "Get in the car," Clint had said that morning, his voice filled with a playful, yet serious tone. "We're going on an adventure. Let's see where the road takes us." Noah, feeling both confused and intrigued, didn't ask questions. He trusted Clint now. After all, if it hadn't been for Clint Eastwood, he wouldn't have even made it through the trial. The two of them drove for hours, the car cutting through the open landscape, the horizon stretching out endlessly. Clint didn't speak much at first, letting the silence between them feel comfortable and unforced. Every now and then, Noah would glance at Clint, wondering if he had some grand piece of advice to offer, but Clint was content to let the moment stretch, like he was waiting for Noah to say something. It wasn't until they stopped for lunch in a small, cozy diner that Noah finally opened up. The waitress brought over their coffee and food, and as the steam from the mug swirled in the air, Noah broke the silence. "You know, Clint, I've been thinking a lot," he began, his voice low. "I've been thinking about what comes next. It's strange. I've had this whole thing with the trial, and now it's over. But I don't feel like I have any direction anymore." Clint leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "That's normal," he said, his voice calm and knowing. "A lot of people go through this after they face something big. It's like the world stops for a moment, and then you don't know what to do when it starts moving again. But you can't stay stuck in the past forever, Noah. There's a future waiting for you." Noah nodded, but there was doubt in his eyes. "But what future? I mean, I don't know if I want to go back to school, or if I even want to stay here. I feel like I've missed out on so much already. Like I'm already behind." Clint smiled slightly, his expression softening. "You're not behind. Life's not a race. You don't need to have everything figured out today. Take it step by step. And you know, sometimes the best things in life don't come from a plan. They come from the unexpected, from taking a chance." Noah shifted in his seat, absorbing Clint's words. There was something about Clint's perspective that made him feel like everything would be okay, even if he didn't have all the answers right now. Maybe that was the key to moving forward, not knowing, but trusting that something would come next. As the afternoon wore on, Clint talked about his own experiences, how he had been through struggles and periods of uncertainty too. Hearing Clint's stories gave Noah a new perspective. Clint Eastwood wasn't just the legendary actor or the sharp, seasoned lawyer he saw in the courtroom. He was a person who had battled his own demons and made mistakes. But Clint had always risen above them. Eventually, the drive took them to a small park by a lake. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the water. Clint parked the car and both men sat in silence, taking in the peaceful moment. "I've been thinking about your future too," Clint finally said, breaking the silence. "You've got potential, Noah. More than you realize. Maybe you should think about a career in law. You've got the drive, the intelligence. And if nothing else, you've got the passion to fight for what's right." Noah stared at Clint, his mind reeling. "Law? Me? I've never even considered that. I don't think I could ever be like you. I mean, I'm not even close." Clint chuckled. "That's where you're wrong. You don't need to be like me. You just need to find your own way. And that may involve a few missteps along the way. But if you've got the heart for it, the rest will follow." Noah's heart raced as he thought about Clint's words. It wasn't the first time someone had suggested law to him, but this time, it felt different. Clint was a living testament to the power of second chances, of redemption. Maybe Noah was looking at his own second chance right now. Maybe his next chapter was waiting to be written. Not in the courtroom as a defendant, but as someone who could help others, someone who could fight for justice the way Clint had fought for him. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Noah admitted. "I don't even know where to begin." Clint smiled, his eyes twinkling. "You start by believing in yourself. And if you ever need a mentor, well, I'm just a phone call away." The offer lingered in the air, and Noah felt the weight of it. It was more than just advice. It was a lifeline. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was standing on solid ground, like he was no longer drifting aimlessly. Maybe Clint was right. Maybe this was just the beginning of something bigger. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Noah made a quiet promise to himself. He wouldn't let this chance slip by. Whatever his next steps were, he was going to take them with purpose. He wasn't going to waste his second chance at life. Clint was right. The future wasn't something to fear. It was something to be shaped, one step at a time. Noah awoke the next morning with a new sense of purpose that had been absent in his life for a long time. The conversation he had shared with Clint the night before echoed in his mind. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel adrift. There was a direction now. There was hope. As he sat at the breakfast table, staring out the window at the world bustling outside, Noah realized that he couldn't keep running from his past forever. He'd been so focused on surviving the trial, on getting through each day, that he hadn't given himself the time to think about what came after. But now, he had a real chance to build a future for himself, one he could be proud of. He had no idea where to begin, though. He didn't have the resources or the knowledge to jump right into a law career. But Clint's words rang in his ears. You just need to believe in yourself. The rest will follow. After a quick breakfast, Noah picked up his phone. He thought about Clint's offer to become his mentor. He wasn't sure if he was ready to dive into law yet, but he was willing to try. He knew he couldn't waste any more time. If he wanted to change his life, he needed to take that first step. He dialed Clint's number, trying to calm the nervous flutter in his stomach. "Hey, Clint," Noah said when Clint picked up, his voice a little shakier than he would have liked. "It's Noah. I've been thinking a lot about what you said yesterday about law, and I think I want to give it a shot. I want to try, at least." There was a brief pause before Clint responded, and when he did, his voice was filled with a warmth that made Noah feel instantly reassured. "Glad to hear it, kid. That's the first step. You've got to want it. You don't need to know everything right now, but you've got the drive. That's the most important thing. You've got to start somewhere." Noah felt a surge of relief, a weight lifting off his shoulders. It wasn't going to be easy, but he could already feel himself taking that first step. "Thanks, Clint. I don't know what to do first, but I'm willing to learn." "Well," Clint replied, "how about you come down to the office tomorrow? I've got some things I need help with, and you could get a feel for the work. It's a start." Noah agreed immediately. He spent the rest of the day preparing himself, gathering up his papers, reading over his old legal books from when he was younger, hoping to shake off the rust. He still wasn't sure what Clint had in mind, but he was ready to dive in. The next day, he found himself in front of Clint's office building, standing outside with a mixture of excitement and nerves. This wasn't just another day. This was the day that could change everything. As he walked into Clint's office, Noah was greeted by a receptionist who ushered him into a sleek conference room where Clint was waiting. The place was polished, sophisticated. Nothing like what Noah had imagined for himself, but here he was. The air inside was filled with the scent of leather-bound books and the hum of quiet, focused conversations. Clint rose from his chair, offering Noah a smile as he gestured for him to sit down. "You ready for this, Noah?" he asked. Noah nodded. "I think so." Clint slid a folder across the table. "This is a case I'm working on. Not one of the high-profile ones, but it's an important one. I need someone I can trust to help me with the research. It'll give you a taste of what's involved. You'll be handling the legal briefs, the documents. I'll teach you the ropes as we go." Noah felt a rush of adrenaline. It wasn't glamorous or grandiose, but it was real. It was a start, and it felt important. "I'm in," Noah said, feeling more confident than he had in days. Over the next few weeks, Noah dove into the work, devoting himself to learning the ins and outs of the legal world. Clint was patient with him, teaching him the foundations of law, guiding him through each document with careful explanations. Noah had expected it to be difficult, but it was more than that. It was challenging in a way that made him want to keep pushing forward, to keep learning more. As time passed, Noah found himself getting better. His research became sharper, his understanding of the law more nuanced. Clint would offer him the occasional word of encouragement, but mostly, he let Noah find his own way, giving him the space to figure things out on his own. But it wasn't just the legal knowledge that Noah was gaining. It was something deeper. As he worked alongside Clint, he learned about resilience, about the importance of integrity, and about how to navigate the complex world of people, power, and justice. Clint wasn't just teaching him about law. He was teaching him how to live. One afternoon, after a particularly challenging case review, Clint turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You've been doing great, Noah, but there's something you should know. Law isn't just about winning cases. It's about understanding people. The law is just a tool. It's the relationships, the understanding of what's right and wrong, that make a real lawyer." Noah paused, absorbing Clint's words. He hadn't thought about it that way before. It made sense. Law wasn't just about following the rules. It was about understanding the heart of the matter, the people involved, and why the law mattered in the first place. "I get it," Noah said slowly. "It's not just about knowing the facts. It's about making a difference. Clint gave him a small smile. Exactly. You're learning. The days turned into weeks, and Noah's confidence continued to grow. He knew there would be setbacks, that this journey would be far from easy. But he also knew that he was on the right path. He had found something that gave him purpose, something that didn't just make him feel like he was surviving, but like he was finally living. The days in Clint's office had become Noah's new normal. He had learned how to navigate the world of legal documents, case briefs, and courtroom jargon. His confidence in the legal world was growing, but the path wasn't always smooth. There were times when Noah doubted himself, when the weight of the work seemed overwhelming. But Clint's steady guidance always brought him back. One evening, as they wrapped up another long day at the office, Clint sat back in his chair, his hands behind his head. He looked at Noah with a thoughtful expression. "You've been doing great, Noah," Clint said, leaning forward. "But it's time for you to step up a bit. I've got a real case coming in. It's going to be a challenge." "You in?" Noah's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected Clint to offer him something so significant yet. He'd assumed he was still far from being involved in the more high-profile cases. "A real case?" Noah asked, his voice a little hesitant but filled with curiosity. Clint nodded, his eyes sharp. "It's a big one. A wrongful termination suit. It's going to be a lot of work, and I need someone to take charge of the research and client meetings. You've been learning a lot, but now you've got to test what you've learned. This is your chance." Noah felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the opportunity to prove himself. But as he thought about it, the weight of responsibility started to settle in. Could he really handle this? What if he messed up? He looked at Clint, who was watching him intently, as if he could sense Noah's doubts. "I believe in you, Noah," Clint said softly. "This isn't about getting everything right all the time. It's about taking the leap and doing the work. You've got this." Noah took a deep breath. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he was determined to try. "I'm in. What do I need to do?" Clint's lips curved into a smile. "That's the spirit. First things first. We've got a meeting with the client tomorrow. You'll be there to observe, but I expect you to take notes and ask questions. Learn as much as you can." The next day, Noah found himself sitting in a sleek conference room across from a well-dressed woman in her mid-30s. Her name was Jenna Harris, and she had filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against her former employer, a large tech company. Jenna had an air of frustration about her. She was sharp, articulate, and her eyes were filled with determination, but there was a subtle undercurrent of vulnerability. As she spoke about her case, Noah could sense the deep injustice she felt. She had been fired after returning from medical leave, and her employer had refused to provide her with reasonable accommodations for her disability. Noah listened closely, taking notes as Clint led the conversation. Clint asked questions, guiding Jenna through the specifics of her case, but it was clear that this was more than just a legal dispute for Jenna. It was a fight for her dignity, for her right to be treated fairly. The emotional weight of her words resonated with Noah, and he found himself deeply invested in the outcome of the case. After the meeting, Clint and Noah returned to the office to debrief. Clint stood at the whiteboard, outlining the next steps for the case, while Noah sat at the desk, organizing the notes he had taken. "You did good today," Clint said, glancing over at Noah. "Now, we need to dig into the legal precedents, find the weaknesses in their defense, and prepare for the next meeting." Noah nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and nervous energy. "I've got a lot to look into. I won't let you down." Over the next several days, Noah pored over case law, legal precedents, and previous wrongful termination cases. It wasn't easy, and at times he felt overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information. But every time he started to doubt himself, he would think back to Clint's words, "You've got this." It was during one late-night session in the office, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights above and the quiet tap of Noah's keyboard, that he found something. A crucial case from 5 years ago that involved a similar situation. It wasn't exactly the same, but it was close enough that it could be used to strengthen Jenna's case. Noah quickly printed the case and ran to Clint's office, his heart racing. Clint was sitting at his desk, reviewing some documents, when Noah burst through the door. "Clint, I think I found something. It's a case that could work in our favor. It's not exactly the same, but the legal principles are similar. If we present it the right way, It could help us prove that Jenna's case is more than just an isolated incident. Clint looked up from his desk, a slight smile on his face as he took the paper from Noah. He skimmed it, then looked back at Noah with an approving nod. "Good work, Noah," Clint said. "This is solid. You've got a sharp eye. Now, we need to build on this. Let's use this as part of our strategy in the next round of meetings." Noah's heart swelled with pride. This was the kind of breakthrough he had been hoping for. It wasn't just about finding the law, it was about finding the right angle, the piece of the puzzle that would make the case stronger. As the days went on, Noah's role in the case continued to evolve. He helped prepare for meetings, assisted with client communication, and even began drafting legal documents. The more he immersed himself in the work, the more confident he became in his abilities. He was beginning to understand what Clint had meant when he said that being a lawyer was more than just knowing the law. It was about understanding people and finding solutions that made a real difference in their lives. Then came the day of the next court session. It was a tense atmosphere in the courtroom as Clint and Noah walked in, side by side. Jenna sat in the front row, her eyes on Clint as he prepared to present her case. Noah's heart raced as he watched Clint, who had once been a larger-than-life figure in his eyes, now navigating the courtroom with the precision and confidence of a master. Clint turned to Noah and gave him a brief, encouraging nod before stepping forward to speak. As Clint began his argument, Noah couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had come so far since that first trial. He wasn't just observing anymore. He was an active participant in the process, contributing to something much bigger than himself. It wasn't just about winning or losing this case. It was about helping someone who needed a voice, someone who had been wronged. And Noah was ready to stand by their side, no matter what. The days following the court session were filled with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Jenna's case was far from over, and the courtroom drama was only beginning to unfold. As Clint and Noah reviewed the case notes one late evening in the office, Noah could sense that Clint's usual calm demeanor was shifting ever so slightly. The weight of this case was beginning to take its toll. The stakes were higher than ever, and Clint, despite his experience, was feeling the pressure. "You're doing great, Noah," Clint said, looking up from the legal brief in front of him. "But this is just the beginning. The real work starts now." Noah nodded, knowing what Clint meant. The easy part, the research and initial strategy, was over. Now they had to prepare for the courtroom showdown. It wasn't just about presenting the facts. It was about reading the room, understanding the opposition, and finding the emotional core of the case. The stakes were personal for Jenna, and Noah could feel the emotional gravity of it in every conversation, every meeting. "Do you think we've got a solid chance?" Noah asked, trying to read Clint's face. Clint didn't immediately respond. He tapped his fingers on the desk thoughtfully, then finally met Noah's eyes. "It's not about whether we have a chance, kid. We've got the law on our side. We've got the facts. But a case like this, it's about more than just winning. It's about making a stand. It's about proving that people matter more than policies." Noah had heard Clint talk about the law before, but this felt different. This wasn't just another legal battle to be won. This was a fight for justice, real justice, for a person who had been wronged. And for the first time, Noah felt that this wasn't just about his career. It was about something bigger, something worth fighting for. As the days passed, Noah continued to immerse himself in the case, meticulously going through every document, every bit of evidence. He pored over testimonies, looking for the smallest inconsistencies or anything that might tip the scales in their favor. But as the trial date approached, he found himself grappling with a bigger challenge, his own fear. He had grown attached to Jenna's case, to her story. What if they lost? What if all of their hard work amounted to nothing? Clint must have sensed his growing anxiety. One afternoon, as Noah sat hunched over his desk, reading through the same page for the 100th time, Clint came up behind him. "You're overthinking it," Clint said, placing a hand on Noah's shoulder. "You've done the work. Now, trust yourself. It's not about controlling every outcome. It's about giving everything you've got and letting the chips fall where they may." Noah sighed, feeling the weight of the pressure lift just a little. Clint was right. He couldn't control the outcome, but he could control his effort. And that's all he could do. He was ready to give it everything he had. The morning of the trial arrived, and Noah could barely contain his nerves. He walked into the courtroom with Clint, his stomach a knot of tension. As they entered the chamber, he looked around, seeing the other lawyers on the opposing side, the judge taking his seat, and the quiet murmur of the spectators in the audience. This was real. This was happening. Clint's confidence was palpable, his movements calm and deliberate. He walked up to the front of the room and addressed the judge with a steady, authoritative voice. Noah sat at the table, trying to focus, but his mind kept racing. He had spent weeks preparing, but now that the moment had arrived, it felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. The opposing lawyer, a sharp-dressed man with a smug smile, stood and began outlining his side of the case. He was articulate and precise, painting Jenna's employer as a victim of a false claim. The company had followed all the correct procedures, and the termination had been completely justified, he argued. Noah listened carefully, taking notes as the opposing lawyer spoke. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he reminded himself that this was the moment he had been preparing for. Clint had told him that law wasn't just about facts, it was about telling a story. Now was his chance to help tell Jenna's story, to make sure the truth was heard. When it was Clint's turn to speak, Noah watched with awe as he confidently approached the bench. Clint began by acknowledging the technical aspects of the case, but then he shifted gears. He spoke directly to the judge, his voice calm but filled with conviction. Your Honor, this case isn't just about policies and procedures. It's about a human being, someone who was denied her basic rights because of a medical condition. Jenna Harris didn't ask for special treatment. She asked for fairness. She asked for the opportunity to continue doing her job with dignity. Instead, she was cast aside, treated as if her health didn't matter. This is not just a violation of the law. It's a violation of the human spirit. The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Noah saw something change in the room. The judge leaned forward slightly, the opposing lawyer shifted uncomfortably, and Jenna, who had been sitting in the back row, sat a little straighter. Clint's voice grew softer, but no less powerful. Jenna doesn't want to be here, Your Honor. She doesn't want to be in a courtroom fighting for something she should have been given in the first place. But this is what we've been forced to do. And we ask for justice, for Jenna, for her family, and for everyone who has ever been treated as less than they are. As Clint finished his statement, Noah felt a sense of pride flood through him. This wasn't just about law anymore. It was about doing the right thing, about standing up for someone who needed help. The rest of the trial played out in a blur. Clint and the opposing lawyer went back and forth, presenting their evidence and making their arguments. Noah was focused, his mind sharp, but his thoughts kept returning to Clint's words. It wasn't just about winning, it was about making a stand. When the trial finally came to an end, Noah and Clint left the courtroom in silence. It wasn't over yet, but they had done everything they could. The waiting game had begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The days after the trial felt like an eternity. Clint and Noah had done everything they could. They had presented their case with strength and conviction, and now all they could do was wait for the judge's ruling. Jenna had left the courtroom with a hopeful, yet nervous expression, her fate now in the hands of the court. For Noah, the wait was agonizing. He couldn't stop replaying every moment in his mind. Clint's closing argument, the look on Jenna's face when she heard the words human dignity echoed in the courtroom, and the sharp, decisive way Clint had commanded the space. It was a lot to process, and in those moments of quiet reflection, Noah began to realize just how much this case had changed him. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was personal. Clint was quiet during this waiting period. He was often hunched over in his office, his eyes glued to legal texts or discussing the case with other lawyers. It wasn't that he was avoiding Noah. It was more like Clint had retreated into his world of law, where distractions were few and focus was everything. One evening, after a particularly long day, Clint finally emerged from his office, carrying a few files under his arm. Noah was at his desk, and when he saw Clint, he couldn't hide the nervous energy bubbling inside him. Clint, Noah started. Have you heard anything? Clint shook his head slowly as he sat down across from Noah. No word yet. It's all in the judge's hands now. Noah tried to ignore the sinking feeling in his chest. He had grown attached to this case, too attached, maybe. But he also knew that the outcome was completely out of his control. "Do you ever get used to the waiting?" Noah asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Clint leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Not really, but you get better at handling it. It's the nature of this business. You give it your best shot, and then you wait. And while you're waiting, you work on the next thing. Because this one will pass, and another case will come along." Noah nodded, though he wasn't sure he'd ever feel comfortable with the uncertainty that came with the job. The waiting was agonizing. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart would leap into his throat. He checked his messages constantly, convinced that any moment the judge would have reached a decision. As the days dragged on, Noah found himself increasingly anxious. He couldn't focus on other tasks. Every case file he reviewed seemed insignificant compared to Jenna's case. He wanted to dive back into it, to find that missing piece that would guarantee a victory. But no matter how many hours he spent researching, he couldn't change the outcome. All he could do was wait. Then, just as Noah was starting to feel like he was losing control, the phone rang. Clint's voice broke through the silence of the office, his tone calm but laced with an urgency that Noah immediately recognized. "Noah, get in here. The judge has made a ruling. We need to be ready." Noah's heart pounded as he grabbed his things and rushed into Clint's office. Clint was already on the phone, his brow furrowed as he listened to someone on the other end. When Clint hung up, he turned to Noah with a smile that made Noah's heart skip. "We did it. The judge ruled in our favor. Jenna wins." For a moment, Noah could hardly believe what he was hearing. "What? Really?" His voice trembled with disbelief. Clint chuckled, his usual calm demeanor back. "Yes, really. It's over. Jenna's termination was ruled unlawful, and the company has to pay compensation. Not only that, but they'll also be required to reinstate her position." Noah let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His shoulders relaxed, and for the first time in days, he felt like a weight had been lifted from his chest. It wasn't just a victory in the legal sense. It was a victory for Jenna, who had fought so hard for what she deserved. Clint leaned back in his chair, his hands folded behind his head as he watched Noah process the news. "I know you've been anxious, but remember, this is the part we fight for. You didn't just help her win a case. You helped her get her life back." Noah sat quietly for a moment, taking it all in. The work they'd done, the long hours and intense focus, had culminated in something real, something life-changing. Jenna had won her case, not just a legal victory, but a personal one. "Thanks, Clint," Noah said, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you." Clint smiled, his eyes softening as he looked at Noah. "That's what I'm here for. You've got the potential to be a great lawyer, Noah. I'm proud of how far you've come." In that moment, Noah realized how much he had grown, not just as a lawyer, but as a person. The journey wasn't always easy, but it had been worth it. The sense of fulfillment that came with helping someone like Jenna was more than he could have imagined. And for the first time, he felt like he was truly making a difference. The next day, Clint and Noah met with Jenna to deliver the good news. She couldn't stop smiling as Clint explained the judge's decision. Tears welled in her eyes, and she hugged both of them, overwhelmed with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," Jenna said, her voice trembling. "You've changed my life." Clint simply nodded, his usual modesty on full display. "You did the hard part, Jenna. We just helped you along the way." Noah, standing beside Clint, felt a warmth spread through him. This was why he had chosen law. This was why it mattered. It wasn't just about winning cases. It was about making a difference in people's lives. As Jenna left the office, a weight lifted from Noah's shoulders. He knew this case had been more than just a learning experience for him. It had been a turning point. It had shown him what it meant to fight for something that truly mattered. And while the victory was sweet, Noah knew that this was only the beginning of his journey. Jenna's victory in court was a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone involved. Clint had always known that the impact of a case could extend far beyond the courtroom, but seeing it firsthand was something else. After the trial, Jenna's life slowly started to piece itself back together. She got her job back, and the company made significant changes to its policies, ensuring that future employees wouldn't face the same kind of mistreatment. But the ripple effects of the case stretched beyond the immediate aftermath. For Noah, life began to feel different. The victory hadn't just been about the law, it had been about justice, humanity, and standing up for what was right. He had been a part of something bigger than himself, something that would stick with him for the rest of his career. It wasn't just about winning cases anymore. It was about changing lives. Yet, despite the victory, there was still a lingering sense of unease. Noah had come to realize that the job was never just about following the law. The system was flawed, and sometimes even the most well-prepared cases didn't always go as planned. As Noah sat at his desk one afternoon, reviewing case files for an upcoming trial, Clint walked in, his face thoughtful. There was something different in the air that day. "You look like you've got something on your mind," Noah said, glancing up from his work. Clint smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I do. It's not always about winning, Noah. It's about knowing when to walk away." Noah was caught off guard. "Walk away?" "Sometimes," Clint continued, "the best decision isn't to fight until the bitter end. Sometimes it's better to cut your losses and move on. Not every case is worth fighting for. Not every victory is a real victory." Noah frowned, confused. "But Jenna's case?" Clint nodded. "Jenna's case was worth fighting for. But not all of them are. And that's something you'll need to learn as you go along." The idea of walking away from a case that seemed like it could be won was difficult for Noah to process. He'd always been the type of person to keep pushing, no matter the cost. But Clint's words lingered in his mind, and he began to question his approach to law. Was he truly doing it for the right reasons? Was he seeking justice, or just chasing wins? The following weeks passed quickly, filled with more case preparations and long hours at the office. Clint continued to mentor Noah, teaching him valuable lessons that went beyond legal strategies. He talked about the importance of empathy, about knowing when to fight for something, and more importantly, when not to. It was a lesson that took time to sink in. One evening, after a particularly tough day, Noah and Clint sat down in the office. The weight of their latest case was heavy on both of them, and Noah was feeling the strain. "I'm starting to get it," Noah said quietly. "The fight, it's not always about winning. It's about knowing when to walk away, when to let go." Clint nodded, his eyes focused on Noah. "You're learning, kid. The law isn't always black and white. There are shades of gray, and sometimes the right answer isn't the one you expect." Just as Noah was about to respond, there was a knock on the office door. They both looked up to see Jenna standing in the doorway, a bright smile on her face. "I've got great news," Jenna said, stepping into the room. "The company has already started implementing the new policies. They're even offering support for other employees who've been through what I've gone through. I can't tell you how much this means to me." Noah stood up, a smile crossing his face. "That's incredible, Jenna. We're so happy for you." "Thank you," Jenna said, her voice filled with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you both enough. You've changed my life. You've shown me what it means to stand up for myself, to believe in myself." Clint placed a hand on Noah's shoulder, and for the first time, Noah saw the pride in Clint's eyes. It wasn't just about the case. It was about the people they helped. It was about the lasting change they could make in the world. "You did all the hard work, Jenna," Clint said with a grin. "We were just the ones there to support you." Jenna nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "You didn't just support me. You gave me hope when I had none. You helped me fight for something that I didn't even think I had the right to ask for. And now I know I have the right." As Jenna left the office, Noah couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The case had been a fight, yes, but it had also been a lesson about resilience, about standing up for what's right, and about the power of giving someone a voice when they've been silenced. The next few weeks were filled with more lessons and more victories. But as the firm continued to grow and take on new cases, Noah found himself increasingly drawn to the idea of fighting for the people who needed help the most, the underdogs, the ones who didn't have a voice. Clint's guidance had been invaluable, but Noah now had a vision of his own. He wanted to make a real difference. It wasn't just about the law. It was about changing the system, one case at a time. The days following the victory in Jenna's case felt like a whirlwind. Clint and Noah found themselves buried in new cases, each with its own set of challenges. But something had changed in Noah. The case with Jenna had opened his eyes to something bigger than just winning cases. It was about righting wrongs, about standing up for people who felt powerless. He had always wanted to help others, but now he understood the gravity of it. The weight of every case, every decision, felt heavier, but at the same time, it felt more important. Clint had noticed the change in him. Noah was no longer just the eager intern who wanted to prove himself. He was growing into a lawyer with a sense of purpose. But Clint also saw the toll it was taking on Noah. The pressure, the emotional weight of every case, was starting to wear on him. Clint had been there once. He'd carried that same burden and learned to shoulder it. He knew Noah needed to learn that lesson too. One afternoon, after another grueling day in court, Clint and Noah sat in the firm's small break room, the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above them the only sound. "You're burning yourself out, Noah," Clint said, breaking the silence. Noah glanced up from his coffee, a look of confusion on his face. "What do you mean?" Clint leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in his lap. "I can see it in your eyes. You're taking it all on yourself. The cases, the pressure, the responsibility. You need to learn how to let go sometimes. You can't carry the weight of every case like this forever. It'll crush you." Noah sighed, his gaze drifting out the window. He knew Clint was right. He had been staying late, working weekends, trying to keep up with every case, every detail. He had always been someone who prided himself on hard work, but lately, it had become all-consuming. "I don't know how to stop," Noah admitted, his voice small. "It feels like if I don't give it everything, I'm not doing enough. Like I'm letting people down." Clint studied him for a moment before speaking again. "You're not letting anyone down, Noah. You're doing your best. And that's all you can do. You have to trust that when you give your best, it's enough." Noah nodded, taking in Clint's words. It was hard to let go of the constant need to prove himself, to be perfect. But Clint was right. He couldn't carry the world on his shoulders, no matter how much he wanted to. He had to find a balance between his work and his well-being. That evening, Clint handed Noah a new case file. "This one's going to be tricky, but I think it's a good opportunity for you to practice what I've been telling you. Don't overthink it. Trust your instincts." Noah took the file from Clint, his fingers brushing against Clint's for a brief moment. He looked up, and for the first time in a long while, he smiled. "Thanks, Clint. I'll try." The next few weeks were filled with a new sense of balance for Noah. He focused on the case Clint had given him, but he also took time for himself. He started going to the gym again, spending more time with his friends, and even taking weekend trips to clear his head. It wasn't easy, but with Clint's guidance, Noah was beginning to understand the importance of self-care in this profession. But just as he thought he had found his rhythm, another challenge emerged. One morning, as Noah walked into the office, he was met with an unexpected sight. The firm's senior partner, Robert, was sitting in Clint's office, speaking with him in low tones. Noah could sense that something wasn't right. He knocked lightly on the doorframe, and both Clint and Robert turned to look at him. "Come in, Noah," Clint said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Noah entered the office, sitting down and looking between Clint and Robert. The tension in the air was palpable. "Something wrong?" Noah asked, his voice cautious. Robert cleared his throat, looking more serious than Noah had ever seen him. "We've got a situation. One of our clients, a high-profile businessman, is facing serious charges. It's a case with a lot of attention, and we need all hands on deck." Noah felt his pulse quicken. He had worked on high-stakes cases before, but this felt different. The pressure, the scrutiny, it would be intense. Robert's eyes locked onto Noah's, and for a moment, it felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders again. "We need you on this case, Noah," Robert continued. "Your research and legal analysis have been top-notch lately. I think you're ready for this." Noah swallowed hard, nodding slowly. This was a big opportunity, but it was also a big risk. The last thing he wanted was to feel like he was back in that place of overwhelm, of working non-stop, pushing himself to the limit. Clint, sensing Noah's hesitation, spoke up. "Take it one step at a time, Noah. We're all in this together. Don't overdo it. You've got this." Noah's mind raced. This was his chance to prove himself, but he also didn't want to lose sight of the lessons he had learned. He had to find a way to strike that balance. The responsibility was heavy, but he couldn't let it crush him again. "I'll do my best," Noah said, his voice steady. He looked at Clint, who gave him a supportive nod, and then at Robert, who seemed to expect nothing less than perfection. As Noah left the office, he felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for, but it would require all his focus, all his energy. He had to give it his all, but this time, he promised himself he wouldn't lose sight of the things that truly mattered. The case ahead would test everything he had learned, and everything he was still trying to understand about himself. But one thing was clear. The world of law was never just about winning. It was about finding the balance between fighting for justice and preserving the person you were fighting for. As Noah prepared to take on the high-profile case, he found himself caught in a whirlwind of pressure. The businessman they were defending, Gregory Williams, was facing accusations of fraud, money laundering, and insider trading, crimes that carried the weight of public scrutiny and a long list of angry investors. With the media frenzy building, it felt like the eyes of the world were on Noah and his team. It was the type of case that could make or break a career. Noah spent hours combing through documents, working late into the night to prepare the defense strategy. His mind raced with the complexities of the case. Every detail seemed like a piece of a puzzle that could be the key to winning, but also to losing. One evening, as he pored over the case files, Clint entered the office, his steps quiet but purposeful. "How's it going?" Clint asked, leaning against the doorframe. Noah barely looked up, still engrossed in the documents. "It's overwhelming," he admitted. "There's so much at stake, and I don't want to miss anything. I can't afford to fail." Clint walked over and pulled up a chair, sitting down across from Noah. "I know what you mean. The pressure can feel like a weight pressing down on you. But here's the thing, Noah. You don't have to carry it all by yourself. This case isn't just yours, it's ours. And we've got the experience to back it up." Noah nodded, grateful for Clint's support, but a lingering doubt gnawed at him. He wasn't just worried about the case. He was worried about what winning it would mean. What kind of people would they be defending? What kind of world were they operating in? As the days passed, Noah's unease deepened. Gregory Williams, despite his affable exterior, seemed to have a coldness to him that Noah couldn't ignore. His smug attitude and the way he brushed off his criminal actions didn't sit well with Noah. There was something about the man that didn't add up, something that felt off. But Noah was a lawyer, and his job was to defend his client to the best of his ability. He had to set aside his personal feelings and focus on the facts, no matter how distasteful they might be. The court hearings began, and the defense team dove headfirst into the case. The prosecution was sharp, its evidence damning. But Clint's calm presence in the courtroom gave Noah a sense of stability. He found himself leaning on Clint's experience more than ever. They were a team, and every move they made, every word they spoke, mattered. But as the days wore on, the pressure became more intense. The media coverage surrounding the case grew more invasive, and Noah found himself unable to escape the glare of the spotlight. Every news outlet had something to say about the high-profile case, and Noah was often the one fielding the questions from the press. It was exhausting. The constant scrutiny, the expectation to perform flawlessly, it started to take its toll on him. One night, after a particularly grueling day in court, Noah found himself alone in the office. Clint had gone home for the night, but Noah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He needed a break, but he couldn't seem to walk away. He had to be there. He had to keep working. Then, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Jenna. "Jenna, hey, I know things are intense right now, but I just wanted to remind you that you're doing an incredible job. I'm so proud of you." Noah stared at the message, the words sinking in slowly. Jenna, despite everything she had been through, had always been a source of support for him. She knew what it was like to be underestimated, to be judged unfairly, and yet she still found the strength to encourage him. Her text was a reminder of something he had lost sight of, his purpose. It wasn't just about winning the case. It was about making a difference. Jenna had reminded him of that when she needed it the most, and now he realized he needed to remind himself. He put his phone down and took a deep breath, staring at the case files in front of him. It was easy to get caught up in the pressure, to let the ambition cloud his judgment. But he had to stay grounded. He had to remember why he was in this, to fight for what was right, not just for a win. But as Noah closed his eyes for a brief moment of clarity, a thought nagged at the back of his mind. Was he doing the right thing? Could Gregory Williams really be innocent? Or was he just another powerful man with the resources to buy his freedom? The following day in court, Noah's doubts continued to haunt him. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were defending the wrong person. Gregory's arrogance was apparent in every word he spoke, and Noah was starting to wonder if he could, in good conscience, continue to represent him. As the trial progressed, things took an unexpected turn. A surprise witness, someone close to Gregory's business dealings, came forward and testified that he had witnessed Gregory ordering illegal transactions. The testimony was a game-changer. The evidence was undeniable. In that moment, Noah felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had known that the case was complicated, but this was different. The very foundation of his defense had just crumbled. He looked at Clint, whose expression was unreadable. "Clint," Noah whispered, his voice tight. "What do we do now?" Clint didn't answer immediately. He simply observed the witness, then turned to Noah. "We do our job, Noah. We fight until the end. But we also remember that sometimes, winning isn't everything." Noah's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure what to believe anymore. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let this case define who he was as a person. He couldn't allow himself to become so consumed by ambition that he lost sight of his integrity. As the courtroom grew tense with anticipation, Noah took a deep breath. He was about to face the hardest decision of his career. And in that moment, he realized that the true measure of success wasn't in winning. It was in doing what was right. Noah sat in the courtroom, staring at Gregory Williams. The weight of the new evidence hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to burst. The once confident businessman now appeared unnerved, his bravado slipping as he squirmed in his seat. Noah felt a strange mix of pity and frustration. The man sitting across from him was no longer the powerful figure he had once seemed. He was just a man, caught in the very system he had once used to manipulate others. And now, Noah had to decide where his loyalty lay, not just to his client, but to his own sense of morality. Clint sat beside him, his eyes never leaving the witness stand. He had seen it all before. The twists, the turns, the games played in the courtroom. But this time, Noah wasn't sure if he could play along. His own internal conflict was growing stronger with every passing minute. It wasn't supposed to be this way. They were supposed to be fighting for justice, for fairness. But now, with the testimony of Gregory's former colleague painting a damning picture of his involvement in illegal activities, Noah wondered if the right thing to do was to turn against his client. Was his job to defend a man who had no regard for the law, or was it to uphold the integrity of the legal system, even if that meant standing against his own client? The judge banged his gavel, signaling the end of the morning session. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as everyone began to gather their things. Noah felt numb as he stood up, his mind racing. "Let's go, Noah," Clint said quietly, rising from his seat. Noah followed Clint to their small office in the courthouse, where the rest of the team was waiting. But as he entered, he didn't feel the usual buzz of adrenaline that accompanied a big case. He felt lost. "What's going on, Noah?" Clint asked as he closed the door behind them, his voice low but firm. Noah ran a hand through his hair, his mind clouded. "I don't know if I can do this anymore, Clint. That witness, everything he said, it's just too much. I don't know if I can keep defending Gregory." Clint studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You've been doing great, Noah. But this isn't just about defending a person. It's about fighting for the truth. And sometimes, the truth isn't what you want it to be." Noah shook his head. "But this is different. I'm starting to believe that Gregory isn't the man he says he is. He's not innocent. And if that's true, how can I continue to represent him?" Clint placed a hand on Noah's shoulder, his tone calm but firm. "We don't know everything yet. And even if Gregory is guilty, that doesn't change your duty as a lawyer. We fight to ensure that he's given a fair trial, that the prosecution has to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. That's what we do." Noah let out a frustrated sigh. "I get that. But how do I defend someone I know is guilty? How do I live with myself if I'm lying to the jury? Clint's expression softened. It's not about lying, Noah. It's about ensuring that the system works. If Gregory is guilty, then the evidence will speak for itself. But it's your job to make sure that no one is convicted without the evidence being presented properly, without it being scrutinized. That's the balance we strike every day as lawyers. Noah took a deep breath. Clint was right. As much as it bothered him, he couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. His job wasn't to pass moral judgment on his clients. It was to ensure they were treated fairly. But even as he thought this, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was protecting someone who didn't deserve protection. "Are you sure I'm ready for this?" Noah asked, his voice barely a whisper. Clint looked at him with a sense of understanding. "You're ready, but you have to believe in yourself. You've got the skills, Noah. What you need now is to trust that you'll make the right decisions. That's what will define you, not just as a lawyer, but as a person." The rest of the day was a blur. The courtroom was tense, and Noah's mind was constantly battling with his conscience. He found himself questioning everything: his motivations, his actions, and even the path he had chosen. Was he really helping people? Or was he just another cog in a broken system that rewarded the powerful and punished the powerless? It was the closing argument that pushed him to his breaking point. Gregory Williams sat smugly in the defendant's chair, his expression one of disbelief that anyone could doubt his innocence. But Noah knew the truth now. The facts didn't lie. Gregory was guilty, and there was nothing Noah could do to change that. The prosecution's case was airtight, and it was clear that Gregory's lies were beginning to unravel. The entire courtroom seemed to sense that the end was near. But Noah couldn't bring himself to stand up and make his closing statement. He couldn't lie, not this time. Clint noticed his hesitation. He leaned over and whispered, "You don't have to do this alone. We'll get through this together, just like we always do." But Noah didn't respond. Instead, he stood up, his hands trembling slightly as he addressed the judge and the jury. I have nothing to add," he said quietly, his voice filled with an odd sense of clarity. "The evidence speaks for itself." The room fell silent. The judge looked at Noah with a mixture of surprise and understanding, but didn't press him further. Gregory's lawyer exchanged confused glances, unsure of what was happening. And just like that, the case was over. In the days following the trial, Noah's decision weighed heavily on him. Gregory Williams was found guilty, and Noah's role in that outcome was undeniable. He had stood by, letting the evidence do the talking. But it wasn't the victory that filled him with unease. It was the realization that he had been willing to let it all slip away, to compromise his own sense of right and wrong. Clint had been there for him through the entire process, offering guidance and support. But as the dust settled, Noah felt more alone than ever before. He didn't regret his decision, but he knew that it had changed him. He had learned a hard lesson. In the pursuit of justice, there would always be moments of doubt, moments when the line between right and wrong blurred. The key was to stay true to who you were, to your values, and to never lose sight of the person you wanted to be. But Noah knew that the journey wasn't over. There were more cases, more challenges ahead. And though he might have taken a step back, questioning his path, he knew that he would keep fighting for justice. After all, that was what he had set out to do from the very beginning. The weight of the case lingered in the air long after the courtroom had emptied. Noah stood in front of the courthouse, his fingers gripping the edge of his suit jacket as he stared out at the city. It was a bittersweet victory. While he had done his job, ensured that the legal process ran its course, he couldn't help but feel as though something inside him had shifted. The line between right and wrong had never seemed so blurry before, and for the first time, Noah questioned whether he was truly ready for the path he had chosen. Clint had stayed by his side throughout the entire ordeal, offering a steady hand and sound advice. But Noah knew the road ahead was going to be more challenging than he had imagined. The victory in Gregory Williams' case had been a turning point, not just in the courtroom, but in Noah's personal journey as a lawyer and as a person. "I'm proud of you," Clint said, standing next to him. His voice was calm, but there was a quiet intensity behind it. "Not just for how you handled the case, but for how you handled yourself. You didn't let it change you, Noah, and that's more important than any win." Noah turned to Clint, grateful for his mentor's unwavering support. I don't know. I feel like I lost something during that case. Something about the whole thing doesn't sit right with me. Clint gave him a sympathetic look, understanding the inner turmoil Noah was grappling with. You've got to remember, Noah, being a lawyer isn't about always being on the right side of the law. It's about making sure the law works for everyone, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. The words resonated with Noah, but they didn't offer the clarity he was looking for. How could he reconcile the victories he had fought so hard for with the moral questions that lingered in his mind? The next few days felt like a blur. Noah's phone was constantly buzzing with calls and messages. Journalists were hounding him for comments about the case. Gregory Williams' conviction had made headlines, and people wanted to know the inside scoop. But Noah didn't feel like talking to the media. He didn't want to be part of the spectacle. Instead, he buried himself in work. He knew that staying busy would help him keep his mind off the nagging doubt that lingered in his chest. But the more he worked, the more he realized that he was trying to outrun something that he couldn't avoid forever. Jenna had reached out to him a few times, but Noah hadn't responded. He didn't want to burden her with his feelings, especially when she had her own battles to face. She had been a source of comfort in his life, a reminder of what was important. But the distance between them had grown since the trial, and Noah knew that it was his own fault. One afternoon, as Noah sat in his office, reviewing case files, there was a knock at the door. He looked up to see Clint standing in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee in one hand and a folder in the other. "You've been hiding in here long enough," Clint said with a knowing smile, placing the coffee on Noah's desk. "You're going to burn yourself out if you keep working like this." Noah smiled weakly, appreciating Clint's concern. "I just need to focus, Clint. The next case is right around the corner, and I can't afford to slip up now." Clint sat down in the chair across from Noah and leaned back. "Listen, Noah, I get it, but you need to take a step back. You've been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders lately. It's time to let go of all the pressure and find some peace." Noah sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know how to find peace right now. I'm too far in. Everything's a mess." Clint's eyes softened. "You're not alone in this, Noah. You've got a team, and we're all here for you. But you've got to take care of yourself. You can't keep pushing forward without giving yourself the chance to heal. You've seen what happens when you keep running on empty." Noah's gaze dropped to the coffee cup in front of him. He hadn't realized how much he'd been avoiding the emotional toll of the job until now. The cases, the pressure, the constant battle. It was all starting to weigh heavily on him. "I don't know what to do," Noah admitted, his voice quieter now. "I'm questioning everything. The work, the people I defend, even my own choices. How do I know I'm doing the right thing?" Clint leaned forward, his tone gentle but firm. "There's no one right answer, Noah. There's no perfect way to do this job. But the important thing is that you're asking the right questions. You're not doing this blindly. And that's what matters. Keep questioning. Keep evolving. And don't be afraid to change the way you approach things if that's what it takes." Noah thought about Clint's words for a long moment. It was hard to admit, but Clint was right. The legal profession wasn't about perfection. It was about growth, learning, adapting, and sometimes it was about knowing when to step back and reassess. That night, as Noah sat alone in his apartment, he found himself looking back at his journey. He thought about the long hours, the late nights spent in the office, and the people he had met along the way. He thought about Jenna, about Clint, and about the friends who had believed in him when he hadn't believed in himself. And he realized that, despite everything, he wasn't alone. He had a team, a group of people who cared about him and who would always have his back. It wasn't about the cases, the victories, or the defeats. It was about the people he surrounded himself with, the relationships he built, and the integrity he maintained along the way. Noah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city. The lights twinkled in the distance, each one representing a life, a story, a decision. He had made a choice, to become a lawyer, to fight for justice, and to stay true to his own sense of right and wrong. It was a difficult path, but it was his path, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. The days after Noah's quiet reflection seemed to unfold in a haze. The city continued its unrelenting pace, and with it, Noah's work carried on. But something had shifted within him, something he couldn't quite name but knew was there. He had been moving through life, fighting for justice and confronting the demons of his past. But now, in the stillness of his office or late at night when sleep was elusive, his thoughts circled back to one question. What happens when justice isn't enough? It was that question that gnawed at him as he sat at his desk, facing yet another case that would challenge everything he believed in. This time, the stakes were higher, no longer about just a conviction, but about the very foundations of his career. The case involved a local entrepreneur, Natalie Winters, who had been accused of embezzling millions from her own company. The evidence was damning. Bank transfers, hidden accounts, witnesses, all pointed to her guilt. Yet, something in Noah's gut told him there was more to the story. It was too clean, too perfect. This wasn't just a case of greed. It felt like a setup, and as much as he tried to push the thought away, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was manipulating the situation from the shadows. "You're thinking too hard again, Noah," Clint said, breaking Noah's concentration as he walked into the office. Clint had been a constant source of support, but lately, even his calm demeanor couldn't ease Noah's restless mind. Noah sighed, rubbing his eyes. "I'm not thinking hard enough, Clint. There's something off about this case, but I can't put my finger on it." Clint leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching Noah with a steady gaze. "You've always trusted your instincts, Noah. Don't stop now. I don't know what to trust anymore. What if I'm wrong? What if I let someone like Gregory slip through the cracks because I let my emotions cloud my judgment?" Clint's eyes softened, and he stepped further into the room, sitting across from Noah. "You're not going to solve this by overthinking it. You've got to follow the facts. If the evidence leads you to one conclusion, then that's the one you fight for. But if it's leading you somewhere else, don't be afraid to dig deeper. The truth is usually buried somewhere beneath the surface." Noah nodded, though the doubt still lingered. "I just don't want to make the same mistake again. I can't keep doubting myself every time the case gets tough." "That's why you're still a good lawyer," Clint said, his voice firm. "You question things. You keep looking for the truth, even when it's easier to just go along with the flow. You're not afraid of what's hard, because you know it's worth finding." Noah paused, absorbing Clint's words. The truth. It had always been the heart of his work. But sometimes the truth wasn't clear. Sometimes it was messy, and sometimes it came at a cost. This case with Natalie Winters felt like one of those messy situations. "Okay," Noah said, standing up. "Let's get to work." The investigation into Natalie Winters was an exhausting, frustrating process. Each new lead seemed to offer a glimmer of hope, only to be dashed by a new layer of complexity. Bank records that seemed to point to her guilt turned out to be manipulated by someone else. Witnesses who had once testified against her began to recant, claiming they'd been coerced or threatened. Despite the chaos, Noah pressed on, his determination to uncover the truth driving him forward. He spent hours going over financial documents, combing through emails, and meeting with Natalie herself, trying to make sense of the tangled web she was caught in. Natalie's story was simple yet compelling. She spoke with such sincerity and conviction that Noah had no choice but to believe her. She had built her company from the ground up, only to see it crumble under the weight of false accusations. "They've tried to break me, Noah," she said, her voice trembling with emotion during one of their meetings. "But I swear, I didn't do this. I'm innocent. Someone's out to get me, and they're using me as their scapegoat." Noah could hear the desperation in her voice, but he had been fooled before. He couldn't let himself get swept up in emotion. Yet, deep down, he couldn't ignore the gnawing suspicion that something wasn't right. As the trial date approached, the pressure on Noah mounted. He was torn between the legal facts, which pointed to Natalie's guilt, and his gut feeling that there was something deeper going on. His team had worked tirelessly, uncovering inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, but they were up against a formidable opponent. The prosecutor was as slick as they came, and he had already painted Natalie as a greedy, heartless criminal. Every word he spoke seemed to sink her further into the depths of her alleged crime. Noah had always prided himself on being able to read people, on being able to understand their motivations. But with Natalie, he was struggling. He couldn't tell if she was truly innocent, or if she was just another person skilled at hiding the truth. Then, as the trial began, something unexpected happened. The prosecutor, in an attempt to bolster his case, introduced a new witness, someone from Natalie's past who claimed to have seen her involved in illegal activity. This person's testimony was chilling, and it cast a long shadow over Natalie's defense. Noah's heart sank. This wasn't the direction he had hoped the case would take. The sudden turn left him feeling exposed, like he had missed a crucial piece of the puzzle. That night, Noah sat in his office late, going over the newly introduced witness statement. He couldn't focus. Every page blurred together, and he felt like he was suffocating under the weight of it all. The stress, the sleepless nights, the doubt. It all felt like it was closing in on him. A knock at the door startled him, and he looked up to see Clint standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Mind if I come in?" Clint asked, stepping inside. Noah motioned for him to sit, his frustration palpable. "I don't know what to do, Clint." This witness. Everything was building up to this case, and now it feels like it's all slipping away. I can't let Natalie go down for something she didn't do. But what if I've missed something? Clint sat down across from him, placing a hand on the desk. "You've been pushing yourself too hard. You're starting to doubt everything, but you need to trust yourself. Noah, you've been down this road before. You know how this works. If you're feeling this much doubt, it's because there's something there, something you're not seeing yet. Trust your gut." Noah let out a heavy breath, looking at the case file in front of him. "I just don't know if I'm good enough to solve this one. I don't know if I'm ready for what it takes." "You're more than ready," Clint said firmly. "You've always had it in you. You just need to remember why you do this in the first place." Noah nodded, taking Clint's words to heart. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about doing what was right, about fighting for justice no matter how difficult it seemed. He had a duty to Natalie, to the system, and most of all, to himself. "I'm going to find the truth," Noah said, his voice stronger now. "No matter what it takes." The courtroom was electric with anticipation. The jury sat in their seats, eyes fixed on Noah, who stood at the center of the defense table, his mind racing but his face calm. Natalie Winters sat beside him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, a look of desperation in her eyes. It was her future on the line, and Noah felt the weight of that responsibility pressing down on him like never before. Today was the day when everything would either fall into place or crumble to dust. The prosecution's case had been airtight, or so it seemed. Every piece of evidence seemed to point directly to Natalie's guilt, from the bank transfers to the testimonies of those who had once worked with her. But there was something Noah couldn't ignore. He could feel the faintest thread of doubt, something buried beneath the surface, just out of reach. The prosecutor, a seasoned veteran named Richard Haynes, stood up, his voice smooth and calculated as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, the facts are clear. Ms. Winters was at the helm of a company that once promised success, only to see it implode under her direction. She embezzled millions, enriching herself at the expense of her employees, her shareholders, and her customers. The evidence is indisputable." Haynes laid out his case with confidence, ticking off every point with precision. Noah's eyes flicked over to Natalie, whose face had drained of color. He could see her holding herself together with sheer willpower, but it was clear to him that the pressure was getting to her. But there was one thing that Noah knew, something that Haynes had overlooked: the details, the inconsistencies, the holes in the prosecution's narrative. He had spent days going through every shred of evidence, every email, every financial document. He had found patterns, inconsistencies, things that didn't add up. It was this that kept him pushing forward. Noah stood up when it was his turn. His hand rested lightly on the back of his chair as he straightened up and looked directly at the jury. The room fell silent, all eyes on him. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Noah began, his voice steady but filled with an intensity that grabbed their attention. "You've heard the prosecution's case. You've seen the evidence, and you've been told that it's all clear. But what if I told you that the case you've heard is not the whole story? What if I told you that this case, the one that seems so neatly packaged, is missing a crucial element: the truth?" He paced slowly in front of the jury, making eye contact with each of them. "My client, Natalie Winters, is not the criminal they've painted her to be. She's a victim of a conspiracy that's been carefully orchestrated. And I'm here to show you the truth that they don't want you to see. Noah could feel the tension in the room as he spoke. He wasn't just defending a client. He was uncovering something bigger, something that had the potential to shake the very foundations of the case. He could see the doubt creeping into the eyes of the jury, and it made him press forward. Back at his office that evening, Noah stared at the case files scattered across his desk. He had been running on adrenaline all day, and now that the trial was over for the day, the exhaustion was catching up to him. He was so close to something that could prove Natalie's innocence, but there was one crucial piece of the puzzle that eluded him. He flipped through the pages once more, his eyes scanning the documents for any sign of something he might have missed. And then, just as he was about to give up, something caught his attention. A bank statement that had been overlooked. A small transaction that seemed inconspicuous at first, until Noah realized that it had been made by someone other than Natalie. His heart raced. This was it, the missing link. Whoever had framed Natalie had also used her accounts to cover their tracks. But the transaction had been made by someone who had access to her private financial details. Someone with a vested interest in seeing her fall. Noah picked up his phone and called Clint. Clint, I think I found something. We need to dig into the details of these transactions. There's a person here who I think is the key to unraveling this whole thing. The next day, Clint and Noah worked late into the night, following every lead they could find. It was a tedious process, sifting through financial records, business dealings, and emails. But then, just before dawn, they stumbled upon a breakthrough. A name that appeared in the financial records, tied to the questionable transactions. It was the name of someone who had been very close to Natalie, someone she had trusted implicitly, someone who had used her trust to orchestrate the entire scheme. Julian Carr, Clint muttered, his voice heavy with realization. I should have known. He had everything to gain from this. Julian Carr was Natalie's former business partner, a man who had been on the board of directors and had a hand in every major decision at the company. But when the business started to falter, Julian had vanished, leaving Natalie to take the blame for everything. He had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. Noah's fingers trembled as he made the call. We need to move fast, Clint. If we don't act quickly, Julian will slip away again. In the courtroom the next day, the tides began to turn. Noah presented his new evidence to the jury, exposing Julian Carr's involvement in the entire scheme. It wasn't just circumstantial, it was damning. The transactions, the hidden accounts, the forged documents, it all pointed to Julian. The prosecutor, Richard Haynes, looked stunned as Noah laid out the case. It was clear that Haynes had been blindsided. The very man who had once been the key to Natalie's downfall was now the one responsible for her ruin. As the trial continued, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Julian was arrested, and his involvement in the fraudulent activity was confirmed. But even as the evidence mounted against him, Noah couldn't shake the feeling that this case had been more than just about one man's greed. It had been a test of his ability to see beyond the surface, to dig deeper, and to uncover the truth no matter where it led. Later that night, as Noah sat alone in his office, the weight of the trial lifted from his shoulders. He had done it. He had uncovered the truth and freed Natalie from the chains that had bound her. But as he reflected on everything that had happened, he knew that this case had changed him. It had forced him to confront his doubts, his fears, and his own limitations. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. The skyline glittered in the night, a silent witness to the battles fought and won. And then he thought about Clint, his mentor, his guide. Without him, Noah wasn't sure he would have made it through the darkness. Clint had always been there, offering wisdom when no one needed it most. Noah smiled to himself. This is just the beginning. The road ahead would be full of challenges, but he was ready for them. The sun was barely up, and the city was already alive with the hum of activity. Noah sat in his office, the morning light filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across the desk. He had just wrapped up a long night of research on his latest case, but the weight of the previous trial still loomed large. Natalie Winters was free, but in the back of his mind, Noah couldn't shake the feeling that this victory was only the beginning of something much bigger. As he prepared his notes for the next hearing, The door to his office creaked open, and Clint walked in, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you could use this," Clint said, offering one of the cups. Noah accepted the coffee with a grateful smile. "Thanks, Clint. I didn't think I was going to make it through last night, but I did it. I got Natalie out of there." "You did more than that," Clint said, sitting down in the chair across from Noah. "You found the truth. You didn't stop digging until you uncovered what really happened. Not everyone has that kind of determination." Noah took a sip of the coffee, his mind still buzzing with the events of the trial. "I just followed the evidence, Clint. It was there all along. But it wasn't until the right pieces fell into place that I could see the whole picture. I still can't believe Julian Carr was behind it all. How did I miss that?" Clint chuckled. "You didn't miss it, Noah. You just didn't have all the pieces yet. That's what makes a good lawyer. You don't stop until you find the missing pieces, no matter how long it takes." Noah nodded, but there was something gnawing at him. He had won the case, but it didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning of something much larger. He had seen the strings pulling behind the scenes, and now he wondered just how far those strings reached. "Do you think it's over?" Noah asked quietly, his eyes locked on Clint. Clint took a long pause, then leaned back in his chair. "No, it's never over, not in this business. There's always more to uncover. You know that. But you've got to take a breath sometimes. Give yourself credit for what you've accomplished." Noah exhaled slowly, trying to shake the unease that had settled in his chest. He wanted to believe Clint, wanted to trust that everything would be fine, but something kept tugging at him. He knew that the case with Natalie Winters had been just one battle in a much larger war, one that involved more than just the legal system. There were bigger players involved, and Noah had only scratched the surface. Before he could voice his concerns, his phone buzzed on the desk, cutting through the silence. He glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. With a raised eyebrow, he answered it. "This is Noah." "Mr. Noah Barnes?" The voice on the other end was calm, but there was an underlying tension. "I'm a private investigator working on a case related to the Winters trial. I think you might want to hear what I have to say." Noah's interest piqued immediately. "Go ahead. What's this about?" The investigator's voice lowered. "I don't have much time, but I've uncovered some disturbing information about Julian Carr. It's not just about the embezzlement. It's bigger. There's a network of people, powerful people, behind Carr, and they've been pulling strings in ways that could shake the entire city to its core." Noah felt a chill run down his spine. Who are these people? What do they want? "I can't say much right now, but I'm meeting with a source later today who can give you more details. If you want to know the truth, you need to meet with me. But be careful, there are eyes everywhere, and not everyone wants this information to come out." The line went dead before Noah could ask any more questions. He stared at the phone, the weight of the conversation sinking in. What had he just gotten himself into? Clint, who had been quietly observing, leaned forward. "What's going on?" "I just got a call from a private investigator," Noah said, his voice tight. "He says there's more to the Winters case than we thought, way more. Julian Carr's involvement goes deeper than just embezzling. There's a whole network behind him, pulling strings in this city. And it's not just about money. It's about power." Clint frowned. "Sounds like we've only scratched the surface, huh?" Noah nodded. "I don't know how far this goes, Clint, but I have to meet this investigator. If there's a chance to take down the people behind Carr, I need to know who they are." Clint stood up, his expression turning serious. "You're going to need backup. This sounds like a dangerous game, and you can't do it alone. Let me help." Noah hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "Yeah, I'll need you. If this is as big as it sounds, we can't afford to miss anything." Later that day, Noah and Clint met the private investigator at a small cafe on the edge of town. The man was in his 40s, with a scruffy beard and a leather jacket that made him blend in with the city's underground crowd. He looked around nervously as Noah and Clint sat down. "Thanks for meeting me," the investigator said in a low voice. "I know this is risky, but I don't have much choice. I've been digging into Julian Carr for weeks, and what I've found is, well, it's bigger than I expected." Noah leaned in, his curiosity piqued. "What have you found?" The investigator took a deep breath. "Carr's been working with a group of influential people, businessmen, politicians, and even a few high-ranking members of the police force. They've been orchestrating deals and covering up their tracks for years. The embezzlement was just one part of it. The real money comes from their illegal operations. Clint's eyes narrowed. Illegal operations? What kind of operations? The investigator glanced around nervously before continuing. Human trafficking, money laundering, the kinds of things most people wouldn't believe could happen in a city like this. But they've managed to cover it all up by controlling the right people. Noah's blood ran cold. You're saying these people have been operating right under our noses, and nobody knew? That's what I'm saying, the investigator confirmed. And Julian Carr is just the tip of the iceberg. He's been their puppet, but now he's been caught in the net himself. They won't stop until they protect their own. Noah sat back, his mind racing. He had always suspected that there was more to the Winters case, but he never imagined anything like this. He was stepping into a world of corruption and crime that was far beyond anything he had ever dealt with before. This is bigger than a courtroom, Clint muttered. We're talking about real power here, and if we go after it, we'll be making enemies. Noah nodded grimly. I know, but we have to do something. If we don't, they'll keep operating in the shadows, destroying lives. I'm not going to let that happen. The investigator nodded. Then we need to act fast. There's a meeting tonight. Some of the key players in this network are getting together. If we can get there and gather evidence, it could be the break we need. Noah's heart raced. We're in. Give us the details. The clock ticked steadily as Noah and Clint prepared for the night ahead. Their hearts beat a little faster with each passing minute. The meeting the investigator had mentioned was happening soon, and they knew that this was their chance to gather the evidence they needed to bring down the network behind Julian Carr. Noah couldn't help but wonder what they were walking into. The investigator had been vague, offering just enough information to pique their interest, but not enough to calm their nerves. Whatever it was going to be dangerous. Of that much, Noah was certain. But they had no choice but to move forward. Clint leaned over the table, checking the gun in his waistband. Are you ready for this? He asked, his voice low, but steady. Noah adjusted his suit and tried to steady his nerves. As ready as I'll ever be. This is the kind of thing I've read about in books, but never thought I'd actually be involved in. If this goes the way I hope, we'll have everything we need to take down some very dangerous people. Clint nodded, his gaze sharpening. I don't need to tell you how high the stakes are. But whatever happens tonight, remember, we stick to the plan. No heroics. Noah gave a tight nod, trying to push away the unease gnawing at his insides. The weight of what was about to happen felt unbearable, but there was no turning back now. The investigator had given them the address, an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was the perfect place for a clandestine meeting. Noah's mind raced with thoughts of what might be going on inside. Who exactly would they be dealing with? The corruption ran deep, and they had only just begun to unravel it. Every move was calculated, every step taken with caution, but the truth was, they were walking into the unknown. When they arrived, the night was unusually quiet. The streetlights flickered, casting long, ghostly shadows over the empty street. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. This is it, Clint said softly, his eyes scanning the perimeter. Stay sharp. Noah nodded, his pulse quickening. They had come this far, but the real danger was just beginning. They approached the entrance cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the sound of the wind in the trees. Clint pushed open the creaky door, and they slipped inside, the faint smell of dust and mildew hanging in the air. The warehouse was large, with high ceilings and empty shelves lining the walls. It was dimly lit by a few bare bulbs, their weak glow doing little to illuminate the vast space. At the far end of the room, a table had been set up, and sitting around it were several figures. Their faces were shrouded in darkness, their voices low and urgent. Noah and Clint moved quietly, blending into the shadows. They could hear snippets of the conversation, but the words were too muffled to make out. Whoever these people were, they had a lot to hide. Suddenly, the investigator appeared beside them, his face tense. We need to get closer, he whispered urgently. They're about to discuss something big. If we can hear it, we can expose them. Noah's heart raced. This was it, the moment they'd been waiting for. He nodded at Clint, and the two of them moved forward with the investigator, careful not to make a sound. They reached the edge of the group, just enough to hear the hushed conversation without being noticed. One of the men at the table was speaking. Carr's downfall has been messy. We need to clean this up fast. The pressure's building from all sides. If this case goes public, it could ruin everything. Another voice, gruff and cold, responded. We can't afford to have anyone dig too deep. If Barnes keeps pushing, we may have to handle him. He's already gotten too close. Noah froze. Barnes. They were talking about him. He knew this would happen eventually. There was no way they would let him get away with exposing them. But hearing it spoken out loud made it feel all too real. Clint placed a hand on his shoulder, signaling for them to move back into the shadows. Noah's mind was spinning. They knew who he was, and now they were talking about taking him down. The stakes had just gone up. The investigator grabbed his arm urgently, whispering, "We need to get out of here. Now. We've heard enough." Noah didn't need to be told twice. He nodded quickly, and they retreated, moving as quietly as possible toward the exit. But just as they reached the door, a loud bang echoed through the warehouse. The group at the table had noticed their presence. "Someone's here," one of them shouted, standing up. "Get them." The room erupted into chaos, and Noah's adrenaline shot through the roof. Clint pushed him toward the door, his voice cutting through the commotion. "Move. Now." They bolted for the exit, with footsteps echoing behind them. But just as they were about to break free, a figure stepped into their path. A tall man, his face hidden beneath the brim of a hat, a gun raised in his hand. Clint reacted instantly, his training kicking in. He shoved Noah to the side, pulling out his own weapon and pointing it directly at the man. "Get down," Clint shouted. Noah dropped to the ground, heart pounding in his chest. The sound of gunfire filled the air, followed by the sharp clatter of bullets hitting metal. The world felt like it was moving in slow motion, every sound amplified as the chaos erupted around them. The man went down, but it wasn't over. More figures emerged from the darkness, and Noah knew they had to act fast. The warehouse was no longer a place of secrets. It had become a battleground. Clint grabbed Noah's arm and yanked him to his feet. "We need to get out of here. Now." They ran for the door, but the chaos was already closing in around them. More shots rang out, and Noah felt the burn of fear in his chest. Every second felt like an eternity. They reached the door just as more figures emerged from the shadows, their guns raised. But it was too late. The door slammed shut behind them as they burst into the night air, sprinting into the darkness of the city streets. Noah's breath came in ragged gasps, his mind racing. They had what they needed, but they had barely escaped with their lives. The danger was far from over, and the forces they were up against were more powerful than they had ever imagined. But one thing was certain, there was no turning back now. The night air was thick with tension as Noah and Clint ran through the alleyways, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, adrenaline pumping through their veins as they ducked behind dumpsters and sidestepped into the shadows. Every corner they turned, they half expected someone to be waiting for them, waiting to finish what had just been started in that warehouse. Noah's heart was still racing, his mind spinning with the aftermath of what had just happened. They had heard enough to confirm the worst. Julian Carr wasn't just the tip of the iceberg. There were powerful people, dangerous people, and they were ready to do whatever it took to protect their empire. And now Noah was in their sights. What the hell just happened? Clint's voice cut through the tension, his breath labored. Noah shook his head, trying to gather his thoughts. "We got what we came for. They know who we are now. We heard them talk about taking me down." Clint's face darkened. "We need to go to ground, Noah. If they're coming for you, then they're coming for all of us. We can't afford to stay in the open." Noah knew Clint was right. They couldn't go back to their offices or homes, not with the people they were up against. Whoever they were, they had resources, and they weren't afraid to use them. The stakes had just escalated in a way Noah hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just about a legal battle anymore. This was about survival. "We'll need to move fast," Noah said, his voice low and urgent. "We have to figure out what to do with the information we've got. If we take this to the police, they'll never believe us. We have to get to the right people, People who have the power to take them down. Clint nodded. There's a way to go about this, but we need to be careful. One wrong move and they'll bury us before we even get the chance to fight back. Noah exhaled sharply, frustration building in his chest. He'd always prided himself on his ability to think on his feet, to stay cool under pressure. But this was different. This wasn't a courtroom or a simple legal case. This was a war, and he was in the middle of it, with no way to know who he could trust. They continued running, their shoes pounding against the pavement, until they reached a rundown hotel on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was a safe place for the time being. A place to lay low and plan their next move. Inside, Clint locked the door behind them and pulled the blinds down over the windows. We can't stay here long, but we need to regroup, he said, pacing the small room. You need to think about what your next move is, Noah. If they're coming after you, you've got to prepare for a fight. Noah sank into the chair by the window, his thoughts racing. He had never imagined that his pursuit of justice would lead him down this path, facing off against a network of corrupt individuals who would stop at nothing to maintain their grip on power. And now, they were after him. After everything he'd worked for, after everything he'd sacrificed, it all seemed like it could come crashing down in an instant. What if we go public? Noah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What if we expose everything, go to the media? Clint stopped pacing and looked at him, his expression hard. If you go to the media, you'll make them a target, and they'll turn the whole thing around on you. No, going public isn't the answer. Not yet. We need a plan that keeps you alive long enough to get the proof we need to bring them down. Noah ran his hands through his hair, his mind spinning. The pressure was mounting, and he could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. He had one chance to get this right. One chance to expose the truth, take down the corrupt network, and save everything he had worked so hard for. But first, he had to survive. The hours dragged on, and as the night deepened, Noah and Clint huddled over the small desk in the hotel room, mapping out their next move. They had a few pieces of evidence, enough to prove that Julian Carr and his associates were involved in criminal activities. But it wasn't enough to bring them down. They needed more, and they needed to be strategic. Do you think we can trust the investigator? Noah asked, his voice tense. He was the one who gave us the lead. But how do we know he's not working for them? Clint's eyes narrowed as he considered the question. I've been around long enough to know that you can't trust anyone in this game. But right now, he's our best shot. He's got the inside knowledge we need. If he's playing both sides, we'll find out soon enough. But we don't have time to be picky. Noah nodded, rubbing his temples. The weight of the decision was heavy, but Clint was right. They didn't have the luxury of playing it safe anymore. They were already in the fight of their lives. As the clock ticked past midnight, they finally decided to reach out to the investigator. They needed him to get them a meeting with someone who could connect the dots between the criminals behind Carr's empire and the higher-ups in the city. If they could get that, they might have enough to bring it all down. Noah picked up his phone and dialed the investigator's number, his fingers trembling as he pressed the call button. The phone rang a few times before the investigator picked up. What do you need? The investigator's voice was raspy, and Noah could hear the strain in it. We need a meeting with someone higher up in the network, Noah said quickly. We need to take this to the next level. Can you get us in? There was a pause on the other end of the line. It's risky, but I might be able to make it happen. You'll have to trust me, though. I can't guarantee your safety. Noah felt his pulse quicken. Trust was a luxury they could no longer afford, but they didn't have a choice. Get us the meeting, Noah said, his voice firm, and we'll take it from there. As Noah hung up the phone, a sense of resolve washed over him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. But he also knew that the road ahead would be more treacherous than anything he had faced so far. There was no going back now. The pieces were falling into place, and they were about to enter the heart of the storm. And in the darkest hours of this battle, Noah realized one thing. Sometimes, the truth you seek comes at the highest cost. The days that followed felt like a blur. The clock seemed to tick louder with every passing second, and the weight of the decisions Noah and Clint had made grew heavier by the minute. They had one shot to bring down the dangerous network surrounding Julian Carr, but that shot was fast running out. Every move had to be calculated. Every decision had to be made with precision. The last thing they could afford was a misstep. Noah sat at a small diner in the heart of the city, waiting for the investigator to arrive. He had been pacing back and forth in his mind for days now, running over every possible scenario, but the conclusion was always the same. There was no way to avoid the danger that was closing in on him. He had to trust the investigator, even though every part of him screamed not to. The bell over the door jingled, signaling the arrival of someone. Noah looked up, his eyes meeting the familiar face of the investigator. His expression was grim, and there was a sense of urgency in his movements as he approached Noah's table. "You look like you've seen better days," Noah said, trying to keep the tension out of his voice. The investigator sat down without speaking for a moment, scanning the diner as if checking for potential threats. "I don't have much time. You need to be ready. The meeting is set for tonight. This is it, everything you've been working for." Noah's heart skipped a beat. The meeting. The one that could turn the tide in this whole battle. It could be the key to everything, or it could be their undoing. "We've prepared," Noah said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "But I need to know, who are we meeting with? Who's going to give us the final piece we need?" The investigator hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "It's someone higher up, someone with direct connections to the people in charge of this entire operation. If you can get them to talk, if you can expose them, it's over for Carr and his associates." "But this is dangerous, Noah. You're walking into the lion's den." Noah's mind flashed back to everything that had led him here. The sleepless nights, the countless risks, the ever-growing sense of urgency. He had fought to get to this point. There was no going back now. "Then we'll walk in together," Clint said, his voice cold and sharp from across the table. He had been sitting quietly, eyes scanning the investigator, never one to let his guard down. "We can't risk letting one of us go in alone. If this goes south, we need to have each other's backs." Noah nodded in agreement. "Right. We stick together on this. We've come too far to screw it up now." The investigator looked from one to the other, clearly sizing up their determination. After a moment of silence, he leaned in and spoke quietly. "You'll need to be prepared for anything. This isn't just a meeting, it's a power play. You're dealing with people who are willing to do whatever it takes to protect their empire. This will test your limits, Noah. Do you understand?" Noah's grip tightened on the coffee cup in front of him. "I understand," he said, his voice low but resolute. As the evening approached, the trio made their way through the darkened streets, heading for the meeting location. The sense of urgency was palpable in the air. It felt as if the very city itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was about to happen. Each shadow felt like a potential threat, and Noah couldn't help but wonder how far these people would go to protect their interests. They arrived at a small, inconspicuous building in the middle of the industrial district, the kind of place that could be overlooked by anyone who wasn't looking for it. The investigator led them through the back entrance, a steel door that creaked ominously as it opened. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a single flickering light overhead. At the far end of the room, a figure stood, their back to them. It was hard to make out any details, but Noah's gut told him this was the person who could finally make a difference. "Is he the one?" Clint asked, his voice low. The investigator gave a subtle nod. "This is the contact, the one who can take us to the people at the very top. If they're ever going to crack, it will be because of him." Noah took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had come this far. No turning back. The figure turned slowly, revealing a sharp, calculating face, someone who looked like they belonged in the world of high-stakes business, not the shadows of a dark room. His eyes locked onto Noah's, a quiet recognition flickering in them. "You must be Noah Barnes," the man said in a calm, measured voice. "I've heard a lot about you." Noah didn't flinch. "You've heard the good, the bad, and the ugly, I'm sure," he said, his voice steady. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure I have. But it's not about what I've heard, is it? It's about what you're willing to do. You want to take down Julian Carr, don't you?" Noah didn't hesitate. "I want to take down everyone involved. Carr is just the beginning. The man's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. I'm not sure you fully understand what you're getting yourself into. You think you're fighting for justice, but you're walking into a war. And once you've crossed that line, there's no going back. You won't be able to tell the difference between friend and foe. Noah nodded. I'm aware of the risks, but I'm also aware that this is my only shot. So, if you're going to help me, then help me. But if you're not, then let's stop wasting time. The man studied him for a moment longer before nodding. All right, Noah Barnes. You've got guts. I'll give you that. But if you want to take down this empire, you're going to need more than just guts. You're going to need evidence. Real evidence. And I've got it. But it's not going to be easy to get your hands on it. You're going to have to earn it. Clint stepped forward, his jaw tight. What do you want in return? The man's smile returned, though it was cold and calculating. The same thing everyone wants in this game, power. And if you're willing to play by my rules, you just might get what you need. Noah felt a chill run down his spine. He had come here for justice, but now it seemed that he might have to make a deal with the devil himself. The stakes had never been higher, and the consequences never clearer. But there was no turning back now. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?